Welcome to Give Up After 3, a critical analysis of BBC's Sherlock, examining each episode of the show. We're going to try and understand the kind of, not how the show went wrong necessarily, but how the show went on for so long with such complexity that by the end of it, fans invented like a super secret episode, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. The way that I've been thinking about it in my head is this is kind of literary forensics. Like, how do we actually follow through? As longtime listeners of my old show will know, I have a deep involving history with Stephen Moffat and Sherlock. So I thought for some balance and fresh perspective, I get somebody in who actually liked the show when they first saw it. So I've also got Darth with me, who is going to be our regular reader, I suppose. What's your history with Sherlock, Darth? Like, I know we talked about it a little bit off mic, but how did you come to it, and what did you think of it?
I'm assuming that was actually my brother who introduced me, because I don't remember if I like randomly stumbled into it myself, but the history is that he and I watched it together, at least with the two of us. We had four roommates who were all really close and watched a bunch of the same shows, so it may have been the group of us all sitting together watching Sherlock back in whenever these were actually starting to air. But when I told him about this show and we were going to be dissecting it, and he was like, "Oh, please don't ruin the show for us, David." So
I can ruin anything.
And so this is definitely one of my favorite series. I have like multiple ideas related to Star Wars that I wanted to use as using Sherlock as kind of a medium for talking about different things in Star Wars. Mm-hmm. So the show is like very important to me, and much like you mentioned with The Witcher, I have some severe blinders on in regards to this show. So a lot of the stuff that you were talking about that is wrong with it, I literally had not seen, because I'm just like, Benedict is awesome.
You're gonna come out of this a changed man. Like,
yes.
This is gonna change your entire view on like reality by the end of it. I was interested in you made a comment the other night about, because I asked you specifically about Doctor Who and Stephen Moffat's run on Doctor Who, which was for those playing along at home, that's season 5 through season 7, I believe, or maybe even season 8. I can't remember which one is his final season, but my exposure to Moffat originally was through Doctor Who, because I kind of grew up on Doctor Who. My dad was really into it, and when he took over as showrunner, I was just starting to study writing properly, like at university, I think. And so for me, it was the first time where I had been able to consume a text that was contemporary through the lens of like actually analyzing it. And what I realized as I started watching it is like, oh, this is really different than what I was watching previously, like even just like one season ago. Why is that? And I quite enjoyed it. Like, I was a huge fan at the time, but I could sense that there was something happening in the back of my head. And then when Sherlock came out, I suddenly saw all of the seams of his work. And I immediately was like, oh, even though I still like Doctor Who, this is not good. Like, this is not the kind of stuff that I like. I want to explain something first, and then I'll read a quote from an article I wrote about a year ago explaining my relationship directly to the text. But I want to cover two things off before we get started. The first is that the structure of the show is going to be each episode of the show will cover one episode of the program itself. So this is going to be episode 1, covering A Study in Pink. Next episode we'll do the following episode. We'll do them in kind of blocks of seasons. So we'll do season 1, we'll take a break. Season 2, take a break. Season 3, take a break. And then season 4 in our finale. So it'll be a limited run series. I'm going to take all the stuff that we talk about and all of the research I've done and make a book out of it, because I just never have enough projects. So you can keep an eye out for that at the end if you want to kind of read a more professional version of a lot of my opinions on this. And I'm hoping that through working through a lot of these ideas with you, I can make sure that I'm not just completely biased in my view as well. Let me read you something from the abstract that I think will set the tone well and explain kind of why I wanted to do this in the first place. So I'm just going to read from my abstract here. So, quote, in their pursuit of the ever-climbing curve of intellectual showmanship, Moffat and Gatiss wrote themselves into a corner by the close of the show. The third episode of Series 4, the show's finale, features a plane full of passengers threatened by the deceased Jim Moriarty. However, the story eventually reveals that Moriarty is still dead. His voice recordings were procured by Sherlock's sister, Euros, who he forgot because Euros killed Sherlock's childhood dog, Redbeard, who Sherlock also forgot was really his childhood best friend and not a dog at all. To say that BBC Sherlock represent those... To say that BBC Sherlock represents the limitations of this mode of storytelling is to understate the absurdity of this script and the critical reaction to this season. The episode was so contrived that audiences invented another episode to explain away the destructive writing choices. Sherlock's absurd stylistic challenges do not exist in a vacuum. The Wet and Speakers infiltrated Doctor Who, Netflix's Cowboy Bebop, and sits at the core of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This style of character writing originated in Buffy and Firefly, yes, but Sherlock's influence on the style of British television's largest intellectual properties prompts further study to answer, once and for all, how did the terrible Euros episode come to be, and why did fans believe it was badly written on purpose in service of a secret good Sherlock episode? End quote. And so I think we're going to try and work backwards to find out just what the freaking hell was going on with this show. And we're going to start with episode 1, A Study in Pink, which was directed by Paul McGowan, written by Stephen Moffat. It originally aired on the 25th of July, 2010. Had approximately 8.7 million viewers at its debut. And content disclaimer, this episode does pretty heavily involve topics of self-harm and suicide. And it was adapted, loosely adapted from A Study in Scarlet. So before we get into the summary, Darth, what did you think coming back to this episode? What was your initial kind of reaction to it?
As I had mentioned in our text while we were kind of planning for this, I've never intentionally gone and tried to take off those blinders and look at the show. It's very much just been a ride that I enjoyed watching the performances of the different actors, and you had mentioned I'm blanking on the actor that plays John, but he does a fantastic job in this opening scene with portraying the emotions of PTSD, etc. And that's something that's very easy to skip over of the way that character is introduced right off the bat, and how much the audience is supposed to empathize with that character and see that this entire first episode is about his growth as a person and his overcoming of all of that past trauma. And it would have been really cool if that was like a subplot, but it would be really cool if they had tied in that overcoming of his trauma into the actual mystery that they were solving.
Yep.
But
Yes, most of my feedback on all of these initial, at least this initial season, is like, wouldn't it have been cool if any of these ideas had anything to do with each other at all at any point? I think I said this to you, but I quite enjoyed it. I always liked this episode. I think it's a really strong pilot that's let down by 30 minutes too much runtime, I think. The diversion with, we'll get into it, but there's a few diversions and cul-de-sacs that are just like clearly filling screen time that don't really do anything. Let me read the summary and then we can kind of start to get really into it. So, across London, people are taking their own lives by swallowing a mysterious poisoned pill. We see 3 unrelated people break down into tears, then take a pink capsule, marking their death. Deputy Inspector Lestrade holds a press conference to calm the public, assuring them that there is no link between these deaths. At this moment, every mobile in the room receives a text with the word wrong. Lestrade ignores this message and eventually receives a text that reads, "You know where to find me, SH." We meet Holmes in the morgue, performing an experiment on a corpse, while the mousy Molly Hooper attempts to flirt with him. Watson is introduced via a mutual friend, and Holmes performs some deductive magic, impressing Watson. Holmes leaves his address before disappearing. Watson moves in with Holmes, and a few days later, Deputy Inspector Lestrade turns to the unconventional Sherlock Holmes, a consulting detective with a penchant for insulting Lestrade's team and ignoring procedure, but he does require assistance, because a new body has been found. Holmes takes Watson with him to the crime scene. Along the way, Holmes deduces that Watson's limp is psychosomatic, while performing another piece of magic reasoning to reveal that Watson's sister is an alcoholic, missing only one detail. He assumed that Harry was a boy, but Harry is in fact short for Harriet. The two attend the crime scene of Jennifer Wilson, who has scratched Rach, R-A-C-H-E, on the floor as she died. Wilson's garish pink coat is soaked with rain, while the pink umbrella in her pocket is dry. Holmes deduces that she was in windy, rainy weather, so windy to prevent the use of an umbrella. And using the lesson he learned in the cab on the way over, Holmes concludes Wilson was scratching Rachel instead of Rach as she died. Holmes then flees the crime scene to pursue a lead. Watson is treated to a needless side adventure, abducted by a mysterious car, and taken to the enigmatic Mycroft homes. Watson then returns to Baker Street, where Holmes has successfully located Wilson's pink suitcase. Holmes has Watson text Wilson's phone as they chat, and gradually reveals that the only thing missing from the suitcase and her coat was her phone. Watson realizes he has now just texted the killer. The mystery now turns to the question of method. How is the killer able to move so freely around London without being spotted? At that moment, a taxi stops in front of 22 Northumberland Street, and the passenger in the back looks around, but does not get out. Holmes and Watson take off in pursuit of the cab, cutting through back alleys until they confront the cab, only to discover it is a tourist. Back at Baker Street, the police are tearing Holmes' apartment to pieces, looking for evidence of Holmes' guilt, along with drugs. The pink suitcase looks bad for Holmes, Lestrade explains. The police argue with Holmes as Mrs. Hudson, flustered, reminds Holmes that his taxi has arrived. Holmes caustically yells at everybody to shut up as he concludes that Wilson planted her phone on the killer, and the word Rachel was the password to her smartphone account. The police and Holmes use this to discover the location of the killer. John sits down, discovering that the phone is indicating it is at 221B Baker Street. Having just come up the stairs to the edge of the room, the cabbie, number 71126, waits patiently. It dawns on Holmes that the cabbie fits the profile of the killer and that he has the missing phone. Without telling anyone, Holmes enters the cab. The cabbie explains he knows Holmes from reading his website and drives home to an empty school at gunpoint. Holmes and the cabbie then face each other in a study room where the cabbie promises a battle of wits. The cabbie then places 2 bottles, each with a large pink pill. One pill is harmless, the other lethal. The game is simple. Choose a pill and the cabbie will consume the other. Through deductive reasoning, Holmes reveals that the cabbie is terminal, and he looks at the left bottle. Holmes then decides this is the deadly pill. He then asks why he can't just walk out, and the cabbie draws a gun on Holmes, demanding he play. Holmes decides to be shot, confident that the gun is a lighter. The cabbie then taunts Holmes as he goes to leave, and Holmes confirms the game is, quote, child's play and not worth his time. Holmes then selects the bottle in front of the cabbie. Meanwhile, John spies the pair from across the street. Holmes stalls, inspecting the pill in the light, preparing to take it, as John fires a shot through the window. The cabbie is hit in the chest. Holmes demands to know if his guess was right, but the cabbie smiles at him. Holmes demands the name of the killer's sponsor, and the cabbie eventually screams Moriarty before he dies. The police arrives, along with Mycroft, who squabbles with Holmes, revealing his position in the British intelligence. The story resolves with Holmes and Watson leaving the crime scene in the hands of the police, while Mycroft increases the surveillance status of Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. Watson's limp is cured, and Sherlock has a new flatmate and crime-solving partner. It's kind of the rough outline of the episode. I guess we should start at the top with, I guess, Watson, like you touched on, and his role as kind of the point of view character. How does this intro work for you, sort of starting with his experience in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I was looking at the time code to see exactly how long. So that first section, before they even get to his therapist, looks like it's a minute 20 or something like that. That's all taking place in the dreams that he was having, and then him kind of walking around his apartment very briefly, right? Mm-hmm. But there's just so much to unpack in that one little section. And then additionally, like just from his perspective, but then looking at the filmmaking, there's some really interesting stuff in there as well. One thing that really stood out to me as odd was if you look back at the actual footage that they use for his supposed stint in Afghanistan, and it does not. The very first shot actually looks like the deserts that we see on the news, but then the rest of them, they look like you're in a tropical-looking forest. Mm-hmm. And it is the weirdest thing to me when I go back knowing he was supposedly in Afghanistan, and I'm sure that they have those things. They have trees, I'm sure, in Afghanistan, but it is not what we picture, you know? Mm. And then additionally, it looks like stock footage from the early 90s. Like, it does not look good compared to the beautiful cinematography throughout the rest of the show. Mm-hmm. So going back and rewatching it, that very first clip that's supposedly his imagination, like and he's not in any of the memories, as from what I remember. It's like he's watching stock footage of other people in his brain.
Yeah, which is interesting. I think it's an interesting stylistic choice. They do it a little bit with when Sherlock does some of his mind palace stuff, and you need to see something, they'll use stock footage to represent ideas and stuff like that. So I think the idea of setting up the concept that liminal dream space, so that like imagination or things you're seeing in your head can be physically represented on screen, I think is what it's trying to set up, where it's like, because that'll become important later when Sherlock starts to do his woozy mind palace magic. Like it's setting up that stylistic thing of we're not to take this as real, because it as you say, like it is, he's first of all not in it, but then also the quality of the footage is significantly lower. But that could also just represent like the deterioration of his memory, and the fact that it isn't fully representative, you know, that it is a dream kind of thing. So I think there's a lot it's doing there to make you A, confused and disorientated, and then B, I guess, put you into the, not the headspace exactly, but give you the impression of the emotionality that he's feeling, that it is disruptive and decayed, and it is fragmented and messy and loud. It does a good job of that, I think.
Yeah, but then cutting, so you cut out of that dream, and then he's laying there in bed, and then you get just such a raw, beautiful emotion of him lying there, like trying not to cry, while the camera is just patiently watching this unfold. You know, it's a beautifully shot scene where the directors know we don't need fancy camera movements. They could have done all of this stuff with cranes and had all of these cool movements, and they're like, no, we got to focus on the actor and the emotions that he's having. And then it cuts to this wide shot, so you could see him actually sit up in bed, and you see how sparse the room is.
The lack of belongings is such a smart, clear communication of like, this is a guy, this is temporary, right? Like he's not at home here. He just simply is existing here. It's such a good shot. And
yeah, and the set dressing is so much more in depth. Like I didn't really stop and pause to look around this room. Any of the previous times that I had watched this show, I'm positive that the color that they chose here, like everything, his carpet, his curtains, the lighting in the room, everything is this like boring beige. And I assume that is part of seeing that nothing happens to him, as he says, and that is part of his character at this point, is that he is the boring beige color, and he hates this, and he wants to be colorful. He wants to be out doing stuff with Sherlock, and the set dressing was very intentional for us to be able to see that going forward. But then when you keep picking apart the stuff in his room, when he goes over and sits down at the desk and he opens the drawer to pull out the notepad so he could start taking notes or whatever, and we see the glimpse of the gun under there.
Yep.
So both foreshadowing for later in the episode, necessary foreshadowing, but also there's the hint of he has a gun, he's obviously got PTSD, we've got hints of suicide. Then you also have like a third possible hint of he's still in a warrior mindset, where he is keeping his gun because he still feels like he's at war. And at this point, we don't know what it is. We just know that he has that gun, and there's all of these implications there.
Do you think that? So a thing that I think this show continues to struggle with as it moves forward is like this version of coming back from a war is very specifically stylized, and you're right. Like it does have a sense of emotionality that I think works really well in this episode, but I also think it fails to really completely understand like the idea that he's waiting to go back into combat kind of thing, or is like sort of still perpetually stuck in that headspace. That does happen to people, but it doesn't. The way that it's then played for laughs later on feels really at odds with how melancholy this opening is. I think to an extent, and I get that you can have that contrast, and it's a meaningful point of contrast that it's like, there is something inherently dangerous about what Sherlock does, but it's a different kind of dangerous than the war. Like I understand that they exist in different spaces, but the thing I struggle with, and we'll talk about it as we move through the exploration of his limp and stuff like that, is what does the show think trauma does to people? And that's a question that we don't need to answer now, but I just want to plant it as like a thing to keep coming back to, because the subsequent episodes in this season are really interested in that. Particularly the next one is really interested in what does trauma do to somebody, where the whole next episode is about childhood trauma matriculating into adulthood. And then by the time the show ends, it's about the childhood trauma of Sherlock's childhood, of his sister, and how that changes his memory. And so something inherently centered in the show about trauma and how it affects us, right? Later on, we have various characters passing away or seeming to pass away, and how does that affect different characters. Something else I did want to point out at the top here is I'm going to do my best throughout not to necessarily spoil the following episodes. So if you haven't seen the show, we'll do our best to not directly spoil what's going to happen. If you want to either watch along or you just want to listen and you don't want to sort of get ahead, so at least we follow it in chronological order. The only thing I will spoil is how the show ends, which I've already kind of alluded to. So wanted to put that out there too. We will be talking about stuff. We may spoil it, but if you're doing a watch along, you certainly can for the first time here.
You know what's kind of interesting? While we were talking about his trauma in this very beginning, and as it's revealed, and it's only like 30 minutes ahead or whatever, that we discover that his actual trauma is just from missing the excitement.
Yeah.
But if they had just shot this opening scene a little bit differently, they could have actually made it more of a clue right off the bat that it wasn't that the beige room was reflecting his personality. It was that his personality was sad because of the beige room. Like he was lacking the excitement, and looking around at everything made him realize how much he lacked that excitement. But what we got kind of made us feel the opposite. It made us feel like I don't know.
I kind of know what you mean, which is it makes you feel like he is boring, not that he is frustrated with boredom. But I mean, so we have that opening sequence where we get John as our point of view character. Then we go into a series of flashbacks of people. There's three people we see doing stuff they wouldn't normally. The first is a guy trying to catch a cab.
Wait. Before we leave that room, there's something really cool I noticed. His coffee mug. Did you ever look at it?
As in, it's got like the hospital symbol or something like that for the army, right?
Yeah.
The Red Cross
I thought that was really cool. I actually had to look it up because I figured they centered on it, so it had to mean something. And assuming
if you're English, you're immediately like, oh, he's a doctor. Like it's like an immediate.
Gotcha.
Gotcha. I'm trying to think of an equivalent in America. It'd be like if you see a McDonald's sign, you know immediately what it is. It's that type of like recognition. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's just so neat to see that the phrase "in arduis fidelis," faithful in adversity, which was the motto of the Royal Army Medical Corps.
Yeah, there you go.
So like all of that was legit to his character. And it was in this same establishing, first scene with the gun. So we see a little bit about his background, about his personality, his mindset. Mm-hmm. We see this, which, as you said, if maybe it's a national thing, you would instantly recognize it. Right beside that cup, though, is also a single apple, which is his breakfast. And there's so much you could pick apart in this one scene that just shows so much about his character. I love the set dressing that they did with this.
I'm pretty sure also on that wide shot there are pills on the dresser in the very foreframe. Like there's two pill bottles, I think.
Yeah. I couldn't tell if that. I thought it was a salt shaker and a pepper shaker, but
I thought salt and pepper for my apple. You might be right. I don't know. I can't
really tell. I can't really tell what that is. It looks like there's spices on the right-hand side of the frame and like a milk jug or something.
Oh, sure, yeah. Maybe like a little coffee tea setup or something. Because I assume this is like a hotel room, right?
It kind of gives that impression. And especially since he was looking for a place to live, you would assume he was living in a hotel prior to that.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting that he has no belongings either. Like, we find this out later when he moves in, but he's got like no stuff to move in with. Which I think is just like a really cool touch for his character, that like the fact that he's come back from the war and he just doesn't have a life to come back to, I think is really interesting. I think so much of my frustration with this is that all of these are really cool ideas that go absolutely fucking nowhere. And that's going to be my internal frustration with this pilot. When we get into the subsequent episodes, it's going to be a lot easier to be like, this thing doesn't work, that thing doesn't work. What's frustrating about this is it's so promising of what it could do. Like you could see a different episode where like the fact that he's bored and things like that, that could have like consequences. Like maybe he's too eager to jump into danger with Sherlock and that gets him into trouble. That's actually what happens in the unaired version of this pilot, which doesn't have the extra 30 minutes, is like, he and Sherlock are fucking about trying to solve the crime and they're too public about it, and it gets Sherlock kidnapped by the cabbie. He gets drugged and knocked out. But in this version of it, like, there are no consequences for John's desire. It just goes unchecked. He just gets to have fun adventures with Sherlock. This is the last time that him being a crack shot or being left-handed will ever have any relevance whatsoever to the story. Like, there are so many points in the next few episodes where this stuff could matter, and it just never does. And that's like, as we get further into it, I think we'll kind of start to see that. This one scene at the start, and probably these opening sequences up until we leave the hospital, you can see the show this could have been. This whole episode. Was there anything else on the hotel room that we wanted to touch on?
There was one thing that was the scene right after that is when he's talking with his therapist. And there were several interesting things you could break down. The fact that he was able to read her writing upside down immediately shows the audience his level of intelligence, because that is freaking difficult to do.
Yes.
Secondly, this is something that I noticed with the Falcon and Winter Soldier. When Winter Soldier, he had pretty much the exact same setup, sitting on a couch having his therapy sessions. And both of them, the framing is exactly the same. The shot is wide. They're sitting on the couch, far right screen. They are completely off center from where you would expect them to be, and it is so intentionally done to make you feel off as a viewer.
That particular shot comes from, I think it's Silence of the Lambs, and then it's reused again in Hannibal, and then just becomes like a staple for like how do you show that therapy is uncomfortable? It becomes a real like cinematic language that becomes really commonly used, and I think it works really well. Also, the sparseness of the therapist office is a thing that you'll see again and again in these kind of representations of therapy, where therapists are either really quirky and they have a bunch of weird shit in their office, or it's really sparse. In reality, it's an office. Like, if you've been to a therapist's office, it's just an office where somebody works. Like, there will be plants, and there'll be like, there's just stuff in there because somebody sits in there all the time. But I like this representation. I like that it's clear, the hinting of trust issues, like, doesn't really come up again. I guess with Mycroft, but like, I don't know. It's kind of complicated in that it never feels like, until the season 3, I think, therapy doesn't really come up again in a big way. It's the next season, isn't it? Yeah. Therapy comes back, and it's like he's going back to visit that space. But yeah, I think it hints at a lot of interesting things. I like the way that even the stuff he's saying is quite guarded. Like, the fact that he's trying to be honest, but he's still not really being honest, I think is a really interesting characterization.
But I also wonder if the entire thing with the therapy was only a vehicle for giving the plot point of the blog.
Yeah.
Because without that, like, most people would not think, I need to write a diary in order to recover from PTSD. That's not a normal conclusion. So they had to have someone force him to write this blog, which is a pivotal point throughout the rest of the series.
It's the foundation of the original stories, is that it's Watson writing about Holmes. Like, the books you read are Watson's writing about what happened. Like, it is the instrumental framing device of the whole concept. Like, you see it in every adaptation, except in Elementary, it's a blog as well. Like, it is central. So yeah, you're right. It does have to get set up at some point.
So I guess that's one thing to their favor, that in this instance, they set up something that did tie in properly throughout the entire series.
Ding,
so
they get one.
They get one.
Hey, we'll see how many. Like, listen, they got one. That's nice. Him being able to read writing upside down never comes up again. Like, this is the kind of stuff where if you were editing the script and like later on he needed to do something, even in this story, right? He's left-handed, but he uses his right hand with his firearm because he doesn't want to damage his writing hand. You could have somehow tied that into like that handwriting moment, or like there are so many opportunities here to like thread little morsels through that then come back and become important later. Or like the fact that like maybe his hand is like he's got really twitchy hands or something at the moment. We could have established that in this scene, but we don't. It's just, well, the blog is important. I'm like, okay, I'll give him that. But my frustration is like, for a show about detail and focus on detail, there just isn't really much to go on.
Yeah, I feel like writers, when they're first coming up with these things, they need to have like a character sheet, like you're building a superhero. So you have to remember if the dude has X-ray vision, right, mm-hmm. or if the dude can fly. So these different powers, if he's left-handed, if he could read upside down, you got to have that on a sheet right here. So as you're writing.
Yeah,
a good writer.
1,000%.
But I don't
like
think
absolutely no, but you do, and that's shit that we do. Like every fucking author who's writing a series has like. I mean, we used to talk about it's really important to know what's in a character's pockets in any given scene, because it makes you focus on what is possible. So instead of them like pulling something out that's convenient for the scene, you have to go, what do they actually have on them? And if they need to have that on them in that scene, we need to go back and make sure it's placed there at some point. And it lets you create a sense of consistency that is otherwise absent, where if your character needs to have a pistol, for example, in the final sequence, we need to see them either acquire the pistol or have the assumed knowledge that they carry one. And this episode does that with John going back for the gun. But you can imagine a different version of this where like perhaps Sherlock needed some tool to investigate a clue, and he put that tool in his coat pocket before he leaves the flat. Right, that's the kind of thing that happens in this show. But yeah, as a writing mechanism, that is something we very often would stop down and do in the editing process. Is go like, what do they have on them? What do they know how to use? What particular skill set do they have? And how feasible is it for all those things to be applied in this sequence? And would that character think to use that tool in this moment is the other thing. Because you can have a character who could do X, Y, Z, but if they circumstantially, if it wouldn't occur to them to do it, that's as equally creates friction with the reader. Where they're like, well, I know that he could do that, but he'd never think to because X, Y, Z. And so it does become, but you're right. I mean, I think Stephen Moffat's whole writing career would benefit from just a series of sheets of like, what does this character want? What can they do? And what's their background? And like, what are their special quirks,
All right, so I mean, the last thing I can think of that's like really super important before we get to the actual like death stuff is the
You mean before the story starts?
But we see the introduction with the brilliant musical theme and all of the amazing cinematography. It just sets such a strong opening to the show with all this stuff that we had with John, and then to see this beautifully shot cityscapes and the camera techniques that they use, the transitions that they use, and then the musical theme. Like that's a big note that I had down from watching this entire episode, is that every important thing, every important sentence has such strong musical backing to enunciate it. Like I think that the music, like maybe didn't make the show, but it sure was a strong point of why this show was so popular.
I totally agree. I think because in this first episode, it's a character, right? Like the music, the soundscape is a character. I think as we progress, we might see that start to become a problem, where in this episode, it's used very deliberately to accentuate and highlight things. And I think moving forward, it becomes we might find that it begins to lack motivation behind its use, and where everything ends up having equal importance because everything is equally big and bombastic and loud.
Yeah. It can also be a crutch. Like for every minor revelation, you've got a huge swell up,
and everything that's described has its sound effect and its weird overlay, and it's like, yeah, but we didn't need that for this thing. This isn't a big revelation. You could just not. Like, yeah, I think that becomes that may become something we see more and more. I'm interested to see how we feel about it as we get through. Particularly season 2 is where it starts to get really egregious from memory. So I'm interested to see how working through this process might give us a bit more of a hint of like, how does that start to happen? Because it's not like overnight the producers and the writers just lost their minds and they were like, everything needs a sound effect and everything's got to have a whoosh behind it and we got to have music for everything. Like that doesn't just happen overnight. It is a progressive like how did we get there? And we do see the seeds of that here. I think the opening, you're right, sets a really strong tone for what we're to expect. and it contrasts nicely against the bleakness of what we just saw. So we're getting the impression that, like, hey, this is not a sad story, not a sad show, but there is some emotionality to it.
Okay, it's not a sad show, but 3 people are about to die, so let's.
Let's go. Okay, so we do get our murder, which is good. It's early enough in the story that I forgive it. There's a few episodes later on in the show where it's like, we're 20 minutes in and there's been no crime. What the fuck? So we see 3 flashbacks of various people doing something they wouldn't normally. The first man is trying to catch a cab, and he's on the phone with his wife. He doesn't like catching cabs. The second man tries to get a cab in the rain with his friend, and then his friend disappears, and then he ends up dead as well. The third woman disappears after trying to catch a cab home. They each nervously take a pink pill before dying. Look, I'll be honest, this is a detective mystery. We start with a body, 3 bodies. I think as a setup, like as an opening salvo for like, this is my detective show story, 3 connected suicides is really strong as like an opening pitch. Like every time I watch this, I'm like, this is a really solid, if you don't know what's happening here, I mean, the answer to what's happening here is largely disappointing, but as far as the setup for a mystery, it's hugely compelling. Because I'm like, whoa, like when I first saw this, I was like, whoa, how could 3 suicides be linked? That's crazy. Like what possible revelation could be behind this? It's really strong as a setup. Now, I guess just to kind of set up the sequence that follows, because then we can start to pick through it. So we kind of have our victims, and then we cut to the police service who are holding a press conference about the latest victim, the MP's death. Sergeant Sally Donovan confirms that the MP's suicide resembles that of Sir Geoffrey Patterson and James Fillmore, and so they're treating the incidents as being linked. Detective Inspector Lestrade notes that all 3 suicides happened in locations where the victims had no reason to be, and they all took the same kind of poison. But absent that, there's no link that they can see between the victims, though they're sure they'll find a link. At that moment, everybody receives a text that says wrong. Once the conference is over, Lestrade receives a message that says, "You know where to find me, SH." Donovan then complains to Lestrade about the behavior of the message sender, but Lestrade says he does not even know how he does it, so he's unable to stop it. It referring to like the text messaging thing where he somehow can bulk text everybody in a room, which never gets explained, which is fine. He's just a smart guy that knows how cell phones work. I'm not mad about it.
I've got a bit about that.
Before that, I just want to call out 2 things that I think are really clever here. I really like Lestrade's characterization in this show. Mm-hmm. I'll talk about him a lot as we go through, but he is, particularly toward the middle and the end of this episode, he's one of the more well-considered characters in this universe as far as his relationship to the world and to Sherlock. I like the way that his history with Sherlock is very understated. They seem to have like an unspoken respect, and this scene is really clever in that we don't need to meet Sherlock yet to kind of understand that like there is something about him that is ineffable to this world, where like Watson is melancholy and difficult he's having trouble. Lestrade and Donovan are really struggling to control this press conference and keep everybody under wraps or whatever. Then you just have this random text message that comes through and disrupts the space. You get a really clear view for the way that Sherlock is going to be interacting with the world moving forward, without him even coming on screen. So I think that does a really good job. There's a line that Lestrade says which really stuck out to me this time. When he's asked how people should stay safe, he pretty bluntly replies like, just don't commit suicide. And I really think it's such good characterization, because I giggled. I was like I chuckled this time. I was like, that's funny but also dark as shit. Like it's so smart to have him be not very good with PR and like not particularly a gentle touch. Him being kind of firm and curmudgeonly, I think, sets him up well to get along with Sherlock, right? You get the foundation of why they could get along, which is that they're both kind of outsiders. Lestrade is a bit more on the inside, but they're both kind of guys who don't really fit into the world so much. And I thoroughly enjoy the way that this sets him up really well for the first time we see him and Sherlock kind of cross paths. What did you think of this sequence and Lestrade?
Well, first off, based on what you just said, is kind of interesting that Lestrade is supposed to kind of come across as this I'm not gonna say like heartless, but the way that he said just, oh, don't commit suicide, makes him sound a little bit heartless. But the delivery and his his persona throughout this whole thing, he feels much more empathetic towards. He doesn't feel cold. Compare that to Donovan. She feels super cold throughout this entire first section where we meet her. Her interactions with Lestrade, her interactions with the press, everything just feels so antagonistic with her, which that's the point of her character. So at least they're being consistent with that. But even the way that she responds when Sherlock texts everyone and Lestrade just kind of like rolls his eyes because he's like, this is normal. But she's like verbally outbursting, angry about this. Everyone ignore that. We don't like him. She's like, brush it off, ignore him.
Yeah.
Which is her reaction all the time to this guy. So it's immediately setting up that precedent. But I just thought how interesting it was that Lestrade's words were cold, but his actions, his mannerisms were kind, whereas her words were kind, where she said, when he says that, she she shushes him. She's like, you can't say that kind of stuff. But her mannerisms were very cold. So they kind of like counter each other. And I don't know if that was just like accidental or if that was because I mean, that's the two characters. That's just how they would normally act. And whether that
I think they just have good chemistry. Like, I just think those two actors have great chemistry in that sense.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that I just keep laughing about once I realized it is there is so much about this show, and you were the one that like clued me into this, that the writers are trying to either make you feel really smart or make you feel really stupid, depending on how Sherlock is interpreting a scene or whatever. And this opening bit just jumped out at me when I first started thinking about it now, about the phone and mass texting. That is there's nothing mystical about mass texting a whole group of people. I could do it right now while we're talking.
Yeah.
And they act like it is some mysterious thing, and they don't know how he does it. It's, I assume, a live camera feed going out, so all he has to do is have that group queued up, have the message typed out, because it's the same thing every time, and then just wait for him to say, Lestrade says something, Sherlock hits a button.
Yeah, it's really straightforward. You could also just write, like, it's pretty easy to write a PowerShell script that just does this. Like, if I have a bunch of phone numbers, I can just have a SIM card in my computer. I could do this now. Like, it's not... Yeah, it's nothing.
But the reason that they did that was very intentional, because they needed a very strong way to bring Sherlock into the story that immediately elevates him beyond these commoners.
Yes.
So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to us once you break it down, but it makes total sense that they had to give this elevation to his character from the very beginning. I'm just not sure how they could have done it better in a way that...
Yeah. I think him inserting himself is interesting as a character trait. Like, he inserts himself into this investigation. Yeah, I don't know what the alternative there is. Do you think that, like... So the other thing this does is it sets up some of the stylistic flourishes of this show, which will eventually become its biggest problem, which is you see the text on screen, like it's sort of in camera. Now, this style is something that Moffat has wanted to do for a long time. You can see the seeds of it in a little bit in Coupling with the way it uses screens. It was set in the 90s, but probably more so in Jekyll, where some of the editing... They never quite get to the point of having text on screen, but some of the transitional camera effects and the way that he uses sound effects, the fact that, like, the texts appear and you hear everybody's text message chime at the same time, like asynchronously, that kind of stuff is seeded in Jekyll and kind of finds its way through here. Obviously, he never got an opportunity to do that on Doctor Who as much. Some of the whooshy camera swipey stuff does find its way into Doctor Who a little bit later, but certainly, and in fact, his first episode of... Doctor Who, the one where it's Matt Smith and the world is going to get destroyed and they're after Prisoner Zero or whatever. There's actually a sequence where it's the Doctor, he's standing in a park and everybody is taking cell phone pictures of the sky because it's changed to like nighttime or whatever. It's like something fucked up about the sky, and it's you get still images and the sound of like cell phone images being taken as you follow through these still images until you eventually get to Rory, who's the only one not taking photos of the sky. And so you can see that style be kind of piloted in Doctor Who, and then eventually make its way directly into Sherlock in this bombastic way. But I think it's a good, gentle introduction to this stuff. And this whole first episode, it's pretty okay. Like, its use is well done. It's smart. It means that you can see what a text message says without having to like look over somebody's shoulder at their phone. I think it's really well placed. But yeah, to your point, like, I wonder if you're right. The purpose of this is we need to know that he is somehow separate and above the regular folk and even the police, but that they don't like that fact, right? Like, that's the key characterization here, which is like that Donovan kind of resents it and Lestrade is resigned to it. That's a really critical sort of apparatus for this version of Holmes. It's not for others, right? Like, in the original stories, it's not really his relationship with the police. Even in like Elementary, that's not really his relationship with the police. But here, I think it's really critical to set that up quite firmly at the start.
Well, it also does so much more now that we've been talking about it. Like, it establishes his relationship with Lestrade, because like when the whole thing ends, he privately texts him and says, "You know where to find me." He doesn't send that to Donovan, so the audience immediately knows they have this relationship.
Yes.
And they trust each other, but not Donovan, and he's not sending it to any other cop. He's only sending it to this one cop. Mm-hmm. So it sets up, and then something that you had kind of touched on was that him interjecting himself like this also introduces his personality and his ego a whole bunch. Because, like, this does not help the situation. Not whatsoever.
Makes it worse.
Not whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it shows that he has an extreme lack of restraint in certain situations where he knows the truth and everyone else is dead wrong. He can't shut up about it.
God, yeah, okay. Can we talk really quick? So can we talk about how every character Stephen Moffat writes as a lead is like this? I actually have a quote that I want to read you from an article I wrote, and yeah, I'm quoting myself, don't at me, in September last year, where I was talking so the article is specifically about the way that Moffat tends to write these like bully characters that are like, but their caustic behavior is like desirable or is like somehow heroic. So I'll just read you this because I think it speaks to exactly what we're touching on. Quote, "The implication is that these rules of polite society are a hindrance for the smart people who get shit done. The mythology of this outsider agent pervades Moffat's work. Indeed, Jekyll, Sherlock, Chalk all center brilliant, tactless men who are imbued with some special talent for solving problems and creating chaos. Chalk focuses on Eric Slatt, the deputy headmaster of a school, who gets himself into as many problems as he solves. He's periodically aggressive, always sarcastic, and prone to lapses in judgment when his ego gets the better of him. Moffat's approach somewhat differs from the CBS procedural police consultant with a special gift trend, in that Moffat's protagonists rarely find redemption. Where Elementary and The Mentalist are intensely interested in seeing their protagonists grow and become active participants in society, Moffat has seemingly little interest in rehabilitation. In fact, his texts indicate that these protagonists are right to remain outside of polite society, for this is where they are the most effective. It's hard to tell if this is a self-conscious criticism, that perhaps Moffat is reflecting on his own behaviors as a brilliant but rude screenwriter who struggles to care about fitting in. Whatever the case, the first season of Moffat's Who is full of Matt Smith yelling at other characters, often." End quote. The bit I want to pull out of that is the idea that that behavior is validated by the results that it gets. That, like, Sherlock is rude, yes, but he's the only one that can get it done, and his rudeness helps him do that, in a sense. And we shan't make a judgment on Sherlock yet. I think as we get through the show, we might see how that matriculates, but yeah, it's certainly starting to, like, it's immediately, like, you see it with his doctor. He's yelling at Amy, he's yelling at people all the time. You see it with Jekyll, where he's just like constantly abusive. Like, all of his works have this kind of, if you're a genius, you also have to you can't fit in properly. And that's probably a grain of truth. There's always a kernel of truth to that, but I think it's something very deliberate here. And we'll see that when we meet Holly and Sherlock, and just that dynamic, I think, is really doubling down on that.
I mean, that did remind me of the problem that I had with Matt Smith's character, and how like anything that you would normally have as a learning experience for the lead character, it ends up just being reaffirmation for him that the human race is wonderful. So it's never like he actually learns and grows as a person. It's just like, oh yeah, you reminded me that humans are awesome.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing with Sherlock. You could kind of maybe see that he has grown from episode 1 where he was by himself, and then all of these journeys with John throughout the rest of the thing. Maybe you could say that he's grown as a character, but I don't think there's enough evidence of that to say that it actually happened. And the fact that he and the Doctor both have the same exact thing just points to that failure as a main writer.
I think it's maybe less failure or more as like he just is focused on something that is just not real. Like that just doesn't happen. Like it's just it's not enjoyable to watch somebody not change for 4 seasons.
Well, I would say that the difference is between being enjoyable and being realistic, because I'm just going to use like Elon Musk as an example. Like, he is so smart and so productive and so visionary that he can pretty much get away with whatever he wants to say. He can, be as much of a douche as he wants to be, and most everyone is going to forgive him because he's like bringing clean energy to the world and blah blah blah, whatever.
Uh-huh.
So, and you can pick any rich person who's actually might be a good philanthropist, and the same thing can apply to this discussion, that maybe it is true that the smarter people are elevated to this point where they are forgiven for their transgressions, because they are literally providing something to the world that the common person knows we cannot provide, so we're going to put up with their crap.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's probably true. Yeah, let's park it for now. I think what we should do is we should continually revisit that as a topic as the episodes go on, because it gets to the point where like it stops being a like, oh, this is like, as you say, like, oh, we forgive it because of the results, and it starts to get to the point where you're like, he is just a dick for no reason sometimes, like with no suggestion of results. Like some of the stuff he does, he's just an asshole for no reason. And that's where I think it doesn't quite work. It's like, it should be motivated. Like the reason he's doing this is so that Lestrade will come to him when there's another victim, so he can get involved and help solve this puzzle. But later on, there are just incidences of him doing stuff for no fucking reason, other than Moffat was like, wouldn't it be funny if he was rude like this? The answer is not really. Like the act wears pretty thin after a while, I think.
Although it's a fine line with them trying to depict that he has some form of social disability, and they never quite land on what he's supposed to have and how they're supposed to depict what he's supposed to have.
I made a
so
note
a lot of these
that.
points, yeah. So like a lot of these points where he's just being rude, it's supposed to be showing, that he can't connect with people. That there's just some block.
We'll talk about it in a scene later, where there's a particular line that I want to pull out and dissect. Where the show completely misunderstands what it's fucking talking about. So then we cut to John. He's walking in the park, who's stopped by Mike Stanford, who recognizes him from their time. They were interning at Bartholomew's, the same hospital. John is like, I might need to leave London since I can't afford an apartment. And Stanford says that he's the second person today that told him that, and takes John to the morgue to meet that person. This is how Watson meets Holmes in the original stories, is through Stanford. So this is like pretty faithful to how that goes. I suppose I'll talk about it when we get to the morgue in a second, but probably the key difference is that in the original work, Sherlock is doing an experiment, but it's a different kind of experiment. So I'll touch on that in a second. Do you have much to say about this little meet cute of them in the park? I mean, other than the fact that Watson seems to recognize him and just completely walks past him, and it's just like not interested in having a conversation, and it's only when he's like, John, and John like sort of resigns himself to that interaction. I thought that was interesting.
Well, part of that I think was very intentional, because Mike actually has a line. It's like, what have you been up to? I got fat. So I think the implication there was that Watson literally did not recognize him. God, because he's like 80 pounds heavier.
It's not how.
I'm just saying.
I know. I understand that's what the text is saying, because Stephen Moffat thinks that fat people are gross. Oh God. God damn shit.
There are a lot of really, really fat Doctor Who villains, aren't there?
There's a lot. There's a lot. There's this really common thread. I don't know why, but of like of obesity being inherently coded as like disgusting or like slovenly. And it's real bad and awful. And this is pretty not egregious. Like I don't have too much of a problem with this. I read it instead as like John not wanting to have a conversation. Like he did recognize when he was just like, I don't want to chat to you because I'm in my own head about the war and stuff.
Yeah, I'm scrolling back through it now, and I'm pretty sure there's he actually has a look on his face of who are you, and then when Mike, he says, you know, Mike Stanford, and Watson actually like nods his head in that you know exact. Oh, I know who you are. So you actually see that on his face right there. Whether or not that was, because I've actually had this exact same thing happen in real life, and I thought this was just something completely out of the movies, where like I walked by someone, said like this was walking into church, I said hello to the wife, literally did not register that the husband was beside her, and I completely ignored him. And then like 2 days later, I'm like, oh man, I ignored that man.
That dude.
I said hello to the wife next to him and ignored, like, I felt so terrible about it. And so point being, like, you could just be so in your own head that this could be very realistic, whether or not they went with he didn't recognize him because he was fat story. But this scene, you know, fills a whole different part, which aside from introducing him to Sherlock, this is also where we're introduced to the I got shot. So without this scene, we don't see, this is the first like wide shot where we see him walking with a cane, and it's the explanation of why he's walking with a cane. And they kept it that simple so they could have the big surprise reveal later that he wasn't shot in the leg. But he
hate it. It's so dumb. What a dumb reveal. Anyway, yeah, sorry. Just
and then to talk about one of probably many people's favorite transitions. They go from this beautiful park outside, transition into Sherlock, and the camera is inside the body bag. Mm-hmm. And the zipper comes down, and you see Sherlock's face. And it is one of the most... I love whoever their director of photography is. There are some ingenious transitions that they do with using just the props that the actor is working with, and they use those props as part of their transitions. You see the same thing just a little bit later when you go up into the laboratory, and Sherlock is working with beakers and vials and stuff, and when the camera like pans past the beakers, they use that as their their transition, their wipe. Something else, that first test that he was doing on the body was, I'm assuming here, but I think it's very likely that he is actually working on 2 or 3 different cases in this one scene. The first one was hitting the body and showing what bruises develop is going to prove the innocence. Then he's up there and he's doing a different test with enzymes or something in the beaker. That's got nothing to do with figuring out if bruises form on a body. So this is likely a very different case than what he's doing. And then I think when he's in the lab that he might even do like a third test, like he does one with a beaker and then he does one with something else. So he might actually be working on 3 different cases right here in this first scene. I'm not positive, but it's a really cool indication of his prowess, his mental prowess, and also his technical prowess, because you see him actually working with the equipment, doing the experiments himself. Whether it's good or bad, you see him beating the dead body himself. So it's good in the sense that you see that he's willing to get his hands dirty. He's not going to hire someone else to do the dirty work for him. But then it's seeing...
Which is so funny, because then that becomes his entire MO moving forward, where every piece of detective work, he's like, no, I had my homeless network do it. I had this person. He just doesn't do any of his work moving forward, which is very funny. I did have one thing before we get to the morgue, which is that when he's having that conversation with Stanford, Stanford's like, oh, well, why don't you just go to Harry for help? And then Watson's like, oh, come on. And so we get the setup there that like there might be a complicated relationship with Harry. And... there's no gender provided, so we don't necessarily get all the data we need. But when that solve happens later, it's certainly set up in that scene. So I just wanted to flag that as like, as far as some of the inductive reasoning we'll see later on. That one seems possible. I guess just to set up the scene really quickly. So, like you were saying, we're in the morgue. We meet Sherlock Holmes, who's doing an experiment by beating a corpse with a riding crop to prove an alibi. And then he's kind of ignoring Molly Hooper's attempts to flirt with him. We then kind of go upstairs in the lab where Sherlock and John meet for the first time. Sherlock asks Mike Stamford for his phone because he needs to text, and John instead offers his. John and Sherlock spar about Afghanistan and Iraq, where Sherlock reveals his amazing ability to deduce things. He concludes that he knows John is an army doctor who is now home from Afghanistan, who has a brother who he disapproves of because of his drinking habits, who walked out on his wife, and that his therapist rightly thinks that his limp is psychosomatic. He then gives his name and his address, 221B Baker Street, before dashing off. So it's kind of like the scene is, it's sort of their first interaction together. And as you say, like the transitions are really cool. It's very well paced. I think the chemistry here is great. I mean, we'll say it again and again, but the chemistry between these two actors is pretty phenomenal.
Badumsh, because he's doing chemistry.
Yes, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I also like opening with Cumberbatch sort of beating this body with a riding crop. It's very like quirky 2010 Tumblr type shit, but I think it does set up this, like you're saying, this willingness to do stuff himself, and also this kind of underlying darkness in him that we'll see kind of hinted at and come in waves throughout the show, that like he isn't bothered by doing this and in fact seems to enjoy it a little bit, which is pretty cool.
Well, it's even worse. I don't know if you noticed how dark that scene really is. You remember Molly's dialogue going into that?
No, what did she say?
She is like, he was a really good guy. I used to work with him. And then Sherlock is like, okay, I'm going to beat the stew out of him.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
like,
good one, man.
Yeah, so she's like, I had a personal relationship with this guy, and then Sherlock does not clock that it might upset her for him to beat the dead body while she's watching. So it's a lot darker for us to know that she had a relationship with him, but then it also gives us more insight into his mentality, which is pretty cool.
By way of contrast, in the original stories, the experiment that Watson walks in on him doing is Sherlock is trying to determine how to identify hemoglobin months after it's dried, as just like an experiment to like add to his tool, crime-solving toolkit. Because if you find a piece of evidence months later, you want to check if it had the victim's blood on it, kind of thing, or the murderer's blood. So I think having Sherlock open with the whipping thing is a really interesting contrast as far as tone setting. What do you think about Molly trying to flirt with him and what that suggests about their dynamic and his place in this world?
I love the dynamic. I definitely love the dynamic from her to him, but from him to her, I'm not quite sure so much. Like the idea that she has this huge crush on a guy who's like Sheldon Cooper and doesn't know what a crush is, that is fascinating to me. It's a lot less fascinating to be looking at him and thinking a girl has a crush on him, but he doesn't notice. Like, that's not quite as interesting, So, like, I see her character as being super fascinating. And then, like, just having the line, the way that it comes off, you can't really tell if he knows that he's doing it. But when she asks him, do you want to go get coffee? And he says, like, cream, 2 sugars. I'll take it upstairs. Like, he's placing an order. And I legitimately think that he is supposed to not even realize she was asking him on a date. She was just offering coffee, and he said, yes, please. Like, he mentally does not see that there's a difference there. And that's just also fascinating that we're seeing so much about his character so early on and with such simple dialogue, Yeah,
it does a lot in a little. Like, it's a lot of legwork. I like their dynamic. I just... The smart guy being attractive and like being sexy because he's smart is like such a Stephen Moffat, a Moffatism, right? Like you see that with his doctor, with basically every character he's written. It falls into that category of like bully who's smart and that makes him attractive because he doesn't want me kind of thing. I think this is like pretty representative of how Moffat writes all women. He just does not understand how to write realistic female characters.
Well, that's also a very modern thing, though, because like rewind to like the 90s when everything was an action movie with big buff stars or whatever, and the smart guy was always a wimpy little nerd with glasses, and they were not thought of as sexy whatsoever. Like, it's a pretty recent trend, although it may have been like the 2010s or something. I don't know. Whenever it actually started,
with 2010, like 2011, 2012 is when it hit big. Like, that was when it hit big on Tumblr and became like the thing, which is like sexy, smart twink guys, like that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I just think it's still inherently a little bit sexist, the way that it's kind of carved out here, and the way that this show will then handle both Molly and Irene Adler a bit later.
Of course, an interesting counter argument is: are they framing his intelligence as sexy, or are they just pointing out the fact that Benedict is attractive? I mean,
I don't know. I think the show will play its hand a little bit later, and we get a pretty fucking firm answer to that. Where a character at one point says, "Smart is the new sexy," and then I vomit. Is what happens, and I'd rather die. Yes, I think at this point it's not clear. I like the interaction when she puts on the lipstick, and he's like, "Why did you put on lipstick?" I thought that was, I don't know, that stuff works fine. I just think it's setting a foundation that could become shaky later. Is all I would like to point out.
And it's really interesting to point out that like she is attempting to flirt, attempting to make herself look better. She takes it off, and he's like, "It was working. Why did you take it off?"
Yeah, it's like, what the fuck, dude?
And it's more about that mentality that he doesn't understand what is going on here. And it is also like I was reading some threads on Reddit that was this exact same thing, and it was like, why do guys not understand when women are flirting with them? And it is a weirdly complex question.
It is.
That is not necessarily just tied to him and whatever mental block that he has, but that also could just be a very stupid guy trait of we just
possible.
Sometimes we don't see it.
It's I would suggest there is also a large element of that. Whereas I think what's a meaningful contrast is then Watson, who like every attractive woman he meets, he's like, "Do you want to go on a date?" like very ineffectually too. Like there's something really interesting about that contrast, which I think they play for laughs a lot in the show, but gets us two really strong axioms of like masculinity. We have Watson, who is like ineffectually asking everyone out, and then Holmes, who is like aggressively asexual in a sense, at least for the initial period here, and then we see some stuff later on. But yeah, I think you might be right. It could also just be that like he is to an extent every kind of smart guy ever who just does not understand social cues. Because like Molly's cute as hell, and like you should go out with her. What are we doing? Like there's also that aspect of like, as far as us as a viewer, you're like, yeah, she seems lovely. Like you seem like an asshole. Anyone would be lucky to have her, and you seem like kind of a prick. So like, what's this dynamic here? Is the other thing.
So getting back to the scene in the lab now, there's just so much that you could that you could decipher just in this one scene. And one thing that I thought was interesting, because you said that talking about the original experiment was looking at hemoglobin, and they might have duplicated that, because Sherlock is looking at something in a petri dish. It looks like it's a little red. There's a vial of something red there, and he's putting a droplet of something on top of it. So maybe they duplicated that same experiment from the original, which would be a cool little throwback. And you actually see... You don't normally see this. Normally when in this show, when they show Sherlock breaking something down and how he'll notice like 15 different things in the span of half a second, they'll go back after the fact and show like slow motion from his point of view. But we actually see that right off the bat here. First, there's actually like a medium shot of Sherlock watching John come in, and it's maybe a second long, and then we go back and we see the same shot later in slow motion when we see the breakdown of all the different stuff.
Yep.
And that was just an interesting little filmmaking technique for them to do to show like real time, this is how quick it was, and then slow mo for you so you could break down everything that happened. And then everything that he breaks down with John in this scene I loved how all of this played out. The one like big flaw that I have was I've sat here with my phone trying to make scratches in the bottom of it.
It's really hard to
and
do,
I'll-
isn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
It's my phone doesn't
Now-
have a, yeah, it's quite a hard.
Yeah. Now the only thing is like this episode came out a while back, so maybe those were like cheaper plastic on those phones, so they're easier to scratch.
It's a slide phone. It's not that old. Like the 2010, they were still decent quality.
Yeah. So no matter what, like I have that deduction.
It's also
is
a
a lot
bullshit.
harder
It's
to-
also a bullshit deduction because like that's just a guess. Like if you have scratches in the bottom of your phone, there could be dozens of reasons for it. Like that's. There's another deduction later on about a wedding ring, which I'll talk about in a second. But like, there are a few that you're starting to see the seeds of it, right? Which is a thing that this is why I wanted to get you involved. Like, there are little things the show starts to do here where they cut a few corners, and then it becomes like, oh no, that's our MO moving forward. Like, it's like they start by kind of, it's the scratches on a phone, and you're like, okay, that seems plausible. And then later on, we're gonna get to some proper bullshit inventing stuff. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the deduction when we get to the cab in the next sequence, like a little bit after this. We have a few interstitial scenes before that. So we have from the morgue, we go to there's in a different place, a woman in a pink skirt and jacket takes a small jar with a suicide pill from the floor. She's kind of like trembling. We then cut to John and Sherlock settling in at Baker Street as the police arrive. Sherlock deduces that there has been a fourth suicide and something must have changed. Lestrade runs in and explains the suicide is different. This victim left a note. Sherlock decides to bring Watson along to the murder, sensing the man's appetite for murder and violence. I mean, there's not much to add to this other than, like, the skull on the mantle's fun. I like that his entire apartment is just a messy nightmare of, like, investigative stuff, and, like, the kitchen island is full of, like, beakers and titration equipment. It's a really good line that I think is really well executed, where they're talking about the skull on the mantle, and Benedict Cumberbatch goes, "Friend of mine." Well, I say friend. And there is this cadence here, which is starting to set up some of his, like, verbal tics and some of his patterns that become really, like, kind of emblematic and iconic. One thing that I think is really fucking smart that I didn't notice until this viewing is Watson and Sherlock immediately both treat Mrs. Hudson like a housekeeper with this sort of this shared, like, I'm more important vibe that they both have. That is a really central kind of linchpin of their characterization as a duo. Like, they are, like, they know they're more important than her, and so they immediately kind of fall into treating her like a housekeeper without any remorse. I think that's a really clever, subtle thing I didn't notice until this time. Is like, you can see why they get along in some regards. But yeah, do you have anything on this scene before we get into the cab?
The interpretation of their interactions with her, I guess, could go different ways, because I had always kind of seen it as she is such a maternal... she feels so much like a mother that they're acting much more like kids waiting to be provided for, you know? And I don't know if that's how the scene was supposed to come across, or if it was supposed to come across like you said, and this was supposed to be kind of showing their ego and that kind of stuff, and it was supposed to be showing that they're kind of jerks or whatever. But that's how I had interpreted it, was that it's some people, especially older women, you can just naturally meet them and you're like, hey, will you bake me some cookies? Because it feels so weirdly natural that this person is a mother that will take care of you. And I don't know if that's what they were going for, but I could see that as an interpretation.
I feel like we need to get, hey, could you bake me some cookies, needs to be a t-shirt. It's a real iconic line that you've just uttered. I have never in my entire life experienced that feeling, but I believe you. I think either way, the purpose of it is, like, to show a sense of general entitlement toward this character. Whether that's, like you say, there's one thing that's going to become increasingly clear the longer we do this show, is that you have a much, like, brighter view of the world than I do, and mine is very, very, like, very kind of, not negative, but yeah, you're certainly a bit more positive than I am.
Which is okay. So that's an opportunity for me to jump back just a little bit because we're talking about their, we're talking about their ego. We're talking about how they're both of them are not necessarily the best person in that scene. And something that we didn't talk about in the lab that I find fascinating is the character of Mike and what point that he actually plays to the story. Because as far as I remember, he doesn't ever appear again in any other episode. He's a one-off.
Mm-hmm.
And so his entire point is to introduce these two characters. Once he does his bit, like, watch the scene. He looks like he's just like a lost child sitting there playing with the stuff on the countertop. Like, he knows he doesn't have a point, but he has to stay there. And it just feels so awkward to me. And Sherlock never actually even speaks to him after he comes in the room.
Yeah.
He just says, hey, this is John over here. And
this is Watson, and that's it, yeah.
Yeah, and then the two of them take it from there, and Mike's just kind of sitting there, and he's like, yep, that's Sherlock. He's like that. And that's pretty much that all he says. And it's just such a weird thing that he comes across as a very, jovial, very friendly guy, and he's obviously concerned about John, and he goes through the effort of trying to help take care of him. But then as soon as Sherlock is introduced, Mike immediately becomes irrelevant. Mm. Which, again, I don't know if that was something they did intentionally or something that was just completely accidental, because once you get Sherlock and John together, nobody else matters, and that's kind of, frequent through the rest of the thing.
I mean, he does treat people like tools, right? Like, that's a real strong...
Yeah, that's kind of what this... Yeah, that's exactly what this feels like, is that he was just a tool that Sherlock used in order to find a flatmate. Which has so many weird implications, because Sherlock doesn't... he doesn't need a flatmate. He never seems to struggle with money. He doesn't particularly like people. Why is he looking for a flatmate? There's so many questions about the entire basic premise of this thing. But like, there's one other really interesting thing about that scene where they meet, which is like, just like with the cell phone scene at the beginning, where the only reason Sherlock did that was to feed his ego, because it didn't help the situation at all. But when he does the breakdown for John, telling him, I know that you were a soldier, I know that you were in Afghanistan, mm-hmm. This is how I knew, like, he's just showing off. There's no reason that he actually needs to do that. It didn't mm-hmm. really help the situation. It just confused John. It didn't move anything forward. So again, you're getting this glimpse into his ego, and you're also kind of seeing a potential downfall of his character, because he is so tied up in himself mm-hmm. and of showing off that you could really see some problems developing down the road.
Which maybe will get explored at some point. To what extent that exploration ends up being anything, or if the show ends up just validating his worldview, we'll talk about when we get to it. But on the deduction, I think it's interesting. So this first deduction about the phone, for example, is almost perfect in the sense that, like, we almost have all the information we need to make the same deduction that he did, with the exception of the engraving. But you can kind of work that out from the comment that Stanford makes about Harry earlier. So you kind of almost have all the information you need to make this guess as well. And what's interesting is that Sherlock admits that he guessed about the drinking part of it, where he's like, oh, that was just a guess. And the only thing he gets wrong is the gender, which is like a 50-50, right? Like, it's a 50-50 shot, so whatever. But I guess to quickly set up the scene, so we've already touched on it a little bit, but they're in the cab on the way to the police scene, and then Sherlock kind of explains his methods. He identifies John's limp as psychosomatic. He analyzes the phone, explaining it was a gift from his sibling with a frayed relationship, etc. Sherlock asks if he got something wrong on his early deductions. John confirms the relationship, the gender, and the drinking, but the gender is incorrect, as we said. John's brother is, in fact, his sister. Sherlock acknowledges that he's not infallible, which is cool. So to set up the next scene, which is kind of complicated. Well, I guess, first of all, before I kind of breeze past it, I think this is one of the few times in the show, and maybe one of the last times in the show, where the deductive reasoning feels like we're a part of it, and that we have an opportunity to get some of this. Like, the fact that the limp is psychosomatic is something that you can actually do yourself. Like, John walks with the cane on the wrong side. Like, if you've ever had to use a cane, you use it on the opposite side of where you're putting the weight. John walks with, he's got the cane in his left hand, and he walks on his left foot, placing it at the same time. That's not how you use a cane. Like, that's really bad for your back. It's not actually helping support anything. So if you know anything about canes, you immediately go, oh, that seems weird. You know that his therapist thinks that he's got some stuff going on and he's traumatized. We know he got shot, but we don't know where. Like, the limp thing, he stands for extended periods of time in the hospital instead of grabbing a chair, which people with limps always grab a chair as soon as they walk into a room. So there's little things you can kind of work it out yourself. So I think there are aspects to this which work really well, but it is kind of the last time the show does this. We'll see in the next scene, it's a bit different when it's an actual crime scene, but some of the, this is one of the first and last kind of proper, like, oh, we could have got that ourselves sort of deductions, which I really, really like. So I'll try and set up the first crime scene where he breaks down this murder. It's going to be kind of complicated, so bear with me. So Sherlock arrives at the crime scene and rubs Donovan and Anderson the wrong way, basically accusing them of having an affair. He and John head inside, and they're greeted by Lestrade, who presents them the crime scene. It's in this empty room upstairs where a victim lies face down. The victim, Jennifer Wilson, wears a pink raincoat and has scratched the word Rache, R-A-C-H-E, into the floorboards with her fingernails as she's died. Anderson suggests that Rache is the German word for revenge, but Sherlock completes the word as Rachel, using the lesson he learned from his missed guess with Watson. Kind of. I don't know. I think it's smart. It's like, yeah, he learned a lesson. Sometimes the simplest answer is the most logical one. And it's the gender as well, where he's like, it's probably a woman because the phone was a woman. He also notices that the dead woman's coat is wet, even on the inside of her collar, but the pocket umbrella is dry, suggesting that she had been in extremely windy, rainy weather too windy for an umbrella. Additionally, Sherlock notices that the woman's jewelry is clean, save for her well-worn wedding ring. The inside of the ring is clean, however, she had neglected the outside, apparently indicating that she had been in an unhappy marriage for more than 10 years. She does not bother to clean the outside, but regularly removes it to conduct more illicit sexual affairs with people who would prefer to believe that she is not married. Sherlock then asks for John's help with the body, but John is basically useless. Sherlock explains everything he's learned. Lestrade points out there was no suitcase, which triggers another stream of deductions. Sherlock runs downstairs, explaining someone must have taken the suitcase, meaning she was forced to commit suicide, and the other 3 victims were murdered. He yells the word pink and then leaves the building in something that is so tonally dissonant, I can't believe it made the final edit. So, this is our first crime scene setup. I think that it's pretty cool. Like, I like the special effects where he's kind of examining the body and it kind of flashes up the clues that he's noticing. And he doesn't tell you, like, what he thinks of it, but it gives you all the same data he has, and then we make the same conclusion. Perhaps with the exception of the location where he determines that it's Glasgow, because we don't have his cell phone. So, like, that's the only bit that we don't need. But it's not really crucial to the deduction. I want to just talk about the ring really quickly, and then we can talk about how well this works writ large. Like, taking the ring off all the time is just, like, not... This is an incorrect deduction. If you wear rings, like, I take my rings off to do the dishes every night. Like, this is not a valid observation, in my opinion. The Adulterer thing comes out of nowhere and is something this episode relies on so constantly as a plot point for this character. Later on, the fact that he's able to make a solve on the case is because she's like a smart adulterer who is really coordinated and like thought to write down the name of her, like, find my phone account. Like, the whole episode's solve of this scene, of this crime scene murder, relies on this adulterer connection that just, like, doesn't make sense to me. Like, I don't think this is how people use rings. My only comment there, like, is it doesn't... Yeah, that doesn't track for me. Like, I'm not wearing my rings right now because I took them off because I was doing the dishes just before. Like, it's common for people to do that. Otherwise, I think the scene works really well. We get all the same data he does, and he makes the solve. What do you think of this as our first, like, detective moment of a crime?
Well, all of the actual detective stuff, I thought was absolutely brilliant. One of the biggest issues that I had was the case and the splatter that it showed on her leg, because we don't actually see, like, we see him observe everything else, but we don't really get a good close-up of that leg, I don't think, in a way that we could actually see that same splatter. Because even trying to go back and find a still frame of it, I was like, is that really splatter from mud or something? I can't really tell. But the most interesting thing to me in this entire scene is the relationship with John and Sherlock and trying to figure out why John is there. Because John even flat out says, "Why am I here?" And Sherlock says, "I'm trying to prove a point." And it's okay.
What point is he trying
He
to
says,
prove?
he says the exact quote was helping me prove a point. Now, that same phrase gets brought up again later. And so I don't know if this is trying to tie in something that I'm just not catching with this entire episode. Like, what point is Sherlock trying to prove throughout this entire thing?
He's trying to prove that Watson misses the danger and that his limp is psychosomatic. That's what he's trying to prove.
So the way that this came across to me was that Sherlock was saying, "I'm trying to prove a point to Lestrade, and you are helping me."
What?
That's the way that I interpreted that line of dialogue, which was so confusing. Because as you said, John doesn't do anything in this scene. Like all he does was smell if there's alcohol on her and deduce that she probably asphyxiated. So he doesn't actually do much. And then the fact that Sherlock, we get this line of dialogue from Sherlock that says, "Anderson won't work with me," indicating that he needs that. I assume that Anderson is their medical person.
He's
right?
like the ME, yeah, medical examiner.
So that gives us the idea that Sherlock needs a medical person to look at these bodies because he doesn't know something.
Yes.
A, that's not true because Sherlock knows everything. That's the point.
Yep.
B, we see him doing experiments throughout the entire show where he has random human body parts in his refrigerator because he's learning everything he can about the human body. So he doesn't need this person with him. But we have these bits of dialogue telling the audience he needs this person with him. So this entire thing just feels... Now, looking back at it, it feels so contrived just as a means to get John involved with the action.
But this is like the show's problem, is that John never does anything ever. Like, ever, the whole time of the show, he's either being kidnapped or he's just there while Sherlock does stuff. Like, John doesn't have anything to do particularly in this show.
Well, that's a big problem with a lot of companions, because yes, like... they'll end up doing something sometimes, but it's usually when the doctor's gone, and half the time they accidentally luck into whatever solution they wound up doing. But for the most part, the companions run around screaming until the doctor comes and rescues them. Like, this is a staple of so many of these, brilliant lead character shows. See, where the companion is just there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. This is kind of why I like early Doctor Who, and then even like when Moffat puts Clara in the show, she's one of my favorite characters because she's constantly doing shit without permission and just like always being an active participant. And Jenna Coleman's brilliant in that role. I don't necessarily like it once Capaldi takes over and their dynamic changes, but before that, it's really compelling. I see, that's interesting that you bring that up because I think you look at Donna and Martha as companions in Doctor Who, and they have such agency, and Rose gets it by the end. But then eventually, you're right, the show just becomes like people running after the Doctor while the Doctor does stuff. I see the problem with this though is that Watson is such an instrumental character in the Holmes mythology. Watson's our point of view. It's how we understand Holmes, and that's really the role in the books and the short stories. Is like Watson helps us understand what it's like to be around Sherlock while he's doing this work, and the mix of excitement and dread and terror as like people are constantly trying to kill them during cases, and Watson has a gun and he's the one that he's sort of basically Sherlock's protector at certain points, which is interesting internal conflict because he's a doctor and he doesn't want to do harm, and that becomes a really central kind of idea that's here. This Watson is like he futzes about doing basically fuck all of nothing. He's there to get kidnapped a lot, and he's just happy to... He shoots a guy in this episode, and it's the last thing he ever does in the entire show, for the most part. Like, otherwise, he's just also there for Sherlock to either talk at or belittle or experiment on kind of thing.
You just reminded me of one of my favorite lines of dialogue that he has in the entire series, and that's, I don't remember who he was angry at, but he says, "I am an army doctor. I know how to break every bone in your body while naming them."
The fuck? What the
I
fuck?
love that.
Do they
I
teach
love
you that at
line.
med school? What's going on? What the fuck? What the fuck? What are you talking about? I've completely forgotten that line. That must be a later season line.
Yeah. But
Jesus
so
Christ.
anyway, what I wonder is if the entire point, because I keep thinking, like, why does Sherlock need him? Like, understanding the main character and their what's going on in their head is so important to really getting into the story. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, why does Sherlock need him around? Because he doesn't need him for his skill. So I'm kind of thinking back to when everyone's quarantined, everyone's working from home, and you're starting to realize, well, I really need to be around people. And I kind of am thinking that that might be the entire point of Watson in this show, at least, is that Sherlock is alone, if not for Watson, and he doesn't have anyone to keep him emotionally grounded. And they might overtly say that later on, that Watson keeps him human.
Well, there's a moment in this episode where that does happen, where Sherlock says something, and then everybody reacts to it, and Sherlock looks at Watson and he goes, "Not good," and Watson goes, "Very not good." And that's a dynamic that you see the Doctor and Clara have, where the Doctor is often really rude, and he'll look at Clara and be like, "Whoops, was that bad?" She's like, "Yeah, that was bad. You shouldn't have said that." And you can see that mimetic resonance here, where it's like, "Yeah, I think you might be right," but that's not a good reason to have a character. Like, he's got a guide dog. Like, that's not a character. Like, he's got an emotional support animal. That's not how you treat one of the greatest characters in Western canon. Like,
which is hilarious, because it should have been the opposite, because we were introduced to John as him being the PTSD one who needs the service animal, but then he ends up being the service animal.
Wow, that explains how the show gets so off the rails, where they're just both acting like lunatics. Just two men who don't understand people, just driving each other even further down that rabbit hole. So I want to beleaguer this really quickly. I think the way the scene ends is fucking absurd, and this is like this was one of the moments when I was first watching the show where I went, "Oh, there's something else happening here that I don't like," where he runs down the stairs and then yells "pink" and runs out the building. Now, what this is trying to do is a Doctor Who ass, like, saying something and exiting scene left, and you're like, what the fuck was he talking about? But it is so tonally wrong after the way that the procedure of the crime scene plays out and where we've gotten to, and the frustration and the type of case they're working on and the setting, like the actual physical setting and the camera shots. This is just like, I cannot believe this made it into the final edit. Like, it's so egregious to me that he says pink and then runs out. Like, it just doesn't make any tonal sense. It doesn't make thematic sense. It doesn't really work on a character level. Like, this isn't the kind of thing that Sherlock does moving forward. I don't know. I think it's very... I just think it's bad, and should have been cut.
I will counter that, because I can remember at least one other time, and there's probably more that I'm not remembering, where they're there having a conversation, and then John looks up and Sherlock is just gone. Because when Sherlock sees something that's part of the mystery, that's all that's in his mind, and he completely forgets that John is there, and then you're left with John looking around going, what just happened? Where did Sherlock go? Mm-hmm. So him running out immediately, to me, feels extremely correct for his character, and it establishes that base point going forward. And I'll have to try to look and see what other scenes we could find to support that theory. But you're right. Like, if we're thinking like this is one of those crime dramas that you would see on TV, like the lead would have been very serious, and they would have all either walked out together, or it would have ended on like a wide shot of them standing there in the room looking down at the body, and then you would have heard the dun dun, and then it goes to the next scene, right? Yep. But the fact that they broke that so intentionally also makes me wonder if they knew that trope, and they were like, this is what is supposed to happen, so let's have our lead character completely be all excited because he doesn't want to be serious. He doesn't care about being serious. He doesn't care about people. He doesn't care that this woman died. And the fact that he's excited gets all of that across in a really unusual way. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it feels weird, but this like introduction to, it's a completely different way of seeing him, I guess. The only time we see him this animated is when he's whipping the dead body. So I don't know, like this, the way that he leaves this building, I really, really loved, because it sets up his character as someone who is so emotionally detached from the reality of the death that he's dealing with.
Interesting. I can certainly see that reading. I don't disagree. That's what it's trying to do. I just don't think it works. Like I get exactly what it's going for. I think it succeeds so much better in other scenes where he will do little things. And there's little subtle things he does that indicate that. This is such a like Stephen Moffat yelling at you across the room, being like, "Look, he doesn't care," and I'm like, I know that already. Like I've watched him ignore Molly. Like I get who this character is. You don't need to fucking strangle me with it. And I think, I don't know. I completely get what they're going for. A slight modification to this is he just doesn't yell back up the stairs. He just leaves. Like there's little tweaks here that would make this, because to your point about the procedural cop shows, I agree. If this was like a standard police procedural, that's exactly how the scene would have ended. Where you see something like Elementary does this often, where Sherlock will leave a scene without explaining himself. The Mentalist is a lot defter at it, where the Mentalist will have Patrick Jane be jovial and lighthearted at a crime scene, but understand the underlying moroseness of it and the seriousness of it, and still do shit like this. But there is a subtlety to it that I think creates a lot more consistent of a tone and voice to both the character and the show. Whereas this, for me, like I think the show does it a lot better later on, and finds its voice a little bit more. I think this is just a bit aggressive for what it's trying to achieve. Would be my.
Well, I also wonder, as someone who I meant to hopefully watch the first episode of both those shows, and I have not yet had time. But are those characters depicted as being completely stable emotionally? Because Sherlock himself, multiple times throughout this show, points out the fact that he's a high-functioning sociopath.
No, they're both off the fucking rails. Like Sherlock in Elementary is a recovering heroin addict, and Patrick Jane, the Mentalist, is so hell-bent on revenge for his family that he very often will get these blinkers on where, like, if he thinks it's going to lead him on the path of the serial killer that killed his family, he will just, like, completely disregard the law. He'll, like, threaten people at gunpoint. Like, he just goes off the deep end.
Well, I guess the bigger question is that this version reminds me so much more of, like, Sheldon Cooper and the way that he does not understand people. And so that's why this scene and yelling pink makes sense, because I could totally see, like, Sheldon's having a friendly dinner with all of his people around, and then he suddenly screams out molecules and runs out the door.
Yeah, but
that's exactly his character, you know?
Which is fine, but, like, Sheldon Cooper isn't anybody. Nobody is Sheldon Cooper. Like, Sheldon Cooper is such a simulacrum of, like, what... I don't know. I have so many complicated feelings about the Big Bang Theory. I think it's less helpful than it... I don't know. The idea of Sheldon Cooper's character is so inherently baffling to me. It's the joke of the Big Bang Theory is always, look at these fucking nerds, and it's pretending that it's never that. It's always pretending it's not that, but it always is making fun of the nerds for being nerdy, and it pretends so often that that's not what it's doing. I don't know. I think with Sheldon in particular, he's an interesting contrast here, because it's almost like Sherlock sometimes ignores this stuff on purpose. Is the feeling that I sometimes get, where he does stuff deliberately to antagonize people. Like he does it with Donovan and Anderson, deliberately to antagonize them. Whereas I think Sheldon, at least in his initial kind of conveyance in that show, it is all completely accidental. Like you're right, he has no awareness. Whereas I think Sherlock at least has an inkling when he's being a dick, and sometimes does it to get a rise out of people, to see what happens, to learn about that person. So I think it's probably a blend of both, is how I would read that, right?
Yeah, I'm curious to, like, now fast forward to the scene where they finally meet again, and Sherlock is on the couch, and John is like, you left me back there. You just took off and left me. So I'll have to review what Sherlock actually says, but because I can't remember if he actually apologizes or anything like that.
Oh, he absolutely does not. He does not.
But I guess the entire crux of that scene making or not making sense is whether or not it's supposed to be another depiction of, his lack of connection with people. But the fact that it then centers, it doesn't just leave after that. Like, we have a scene with Donovan and John downstairs, and John's like, yo, I'm a disabled dude, I don't know where I am. Like, so the audience is even more so like getting into his head and seeing, oh wow, Sherlock is really a jerk, he just left this, lame dude out in the middle of nowhere. So like the entire thing, at least it wasn't as haphazard as it could have been. Like, at least the directors kept going with, and they had a bigger plan for. It wasn't just, oh, yell pink, that'll be funny, and then have him leave. It wasn't just that. It was like they tried to tie it into everything.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. It's unfortunate that where it goes. It's unfortunate that is then bolted into the next thing that happens, like, which is the car and stuff, which we'll talk about in a second. But like, yeah, I think you're right. They commit to it, right? You have the melancholy of like John trying to walk down the stairs and he's clearly in pain. Let me just grab another glass of water and then we'll talk about the weird cul-de-sac. Give me 2 seconds. It's also just occurred to me that at some point, like, Moffat had to write in his script, like, Sherlock runs down the stairs and yells pink and then runs out of the building. And, like, that was in a script for, like, a few months before they started shooting. And no one was like, what are we doing? All right, where were we? So...
I mean, it's also interesting just to think about it from, like, that is such a big hook. Like, the first big hook of this episode was, how could suicides be linked?
Yeah.
Like you said, that is such a strong hook. But the idea of him running out, shouting a nonsensical word that is obviously tied to the dead body, and now the audience is not just confused, but we're trying to rewind everything we just saw and think, what did he notice? What did he see that I didn't see? So there's a whole lot more playing into it, I think, than just the director just, trying to do something. Like, I could see, J.J. Abrams doing something like this where there's no thought behind it. Yeah. But at least this feels like there's some thought behind it, whether or not it played out the best way possible. I will not argue that.
You make a valid point, which is this episode is very deliberate, and we are going to get into episodes later that are just... they just stop giving a shit at all. You made an interesting point, which has only just now occurred to me, which is, I think it's a real mistake that the pills are also pink and the victim is pink, like that she's wearing pink, because they have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. It just is a coincidence.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. I know the episode's called A Study in Pink, which is like a reference to A Study in Scarlet, but like, that just seems like, just make the pills a different color. If you knew that the whole thing was going to be pink, was going to be the victims. I don't know. It's a small, like, there's a thing in writing where things can sometimes feel a bit too convenient or like adjacent. And for me, like, it just is getting into that territory of like, this feels too neat to me in some sense. But yeah, so John heads outside. He's looking for a cab. And we get a really interesting exchange with Donovan where she's like, he gets off on this stuff, and one day, solving it's not going to be enough. Like, we're going to find a body, and it's going to be here. He's going to have done it. And we get an interesting setup for later in the episode where John might suspect that Sherlock has done the murders, which in this episode is just a cool, like, there's a bit of tension there. What it sets up writ large across the series is there is something about Sherlock where there is a darkness to him, where, like, it doesn't seem unreasonable that he might cross that line. It doesn't seem that far away from possibility, at least for the first 2 or 3 seasons, and then we kind of get a different characterization of him. But I really like that. I think the show thinks it's a lot more interesting than it is as an idea, because it does come back multiple times. But it works really well here for me, where you kind of go, yeah, he does seem... There's something gleeful about his absorption of what's occurring.
Which ironically makes a lot of sense realistically, because like a lot of the guys that I work with, we do like AV installations and stuff like that, and some of their favorite stuff to do is to figure out why stuff doesn't work.
Yeah.
And the challenge of not knowing something and then figuring something out is way more interesting to them than just doing everyday stuff. So the idea that Sherlock gets off on this solving mysteries tracks logically.
I mean, it's what we're doing now. Like, this is the whole point of this show and the book I'm working on, is like, I want to know how we get there. And it's going to be complicated and difficult and require like tons of research and attention and effort and time. But it's more interesting than going like, did we enjoy the show or not? Right? Like, this is a much more... So like, you can see how that kind of... It is a very relatable thing. It's just, we wouldn't often be interested in murder necessarily.
Yeah. And for another +1 for them of, setting stuff up, because that line of, one day he's going to be the villain, that's a huge plot point later on.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's a good one or not.
No, I forgot that happens. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. It's technically foreshadowing.
Yes. So at least they are planning ahead. At least they are putting the effort forth. Maybe they're not good at it.
I forgot that's what happens. Oh, God. Oh, no. Yeah. You're not wrong. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
All right. So let's get into your favorite part here, and we'll
God. Okay, yeah.
talk about Mycroft a little bit.
Yeah, so a black sedan arrives, and John enters. There's a woman in the car who identifies herself as Anthea. He's driven to a warehouse where a tall man leaning on an umbrella awaits him. He's offered a seat, but John defiantly remains standing. The man interrogates John's relationship with Sherlock, finally revealing that he is Sherlock's arch enemy, something that John finds patently absurd. John refuses the man's offer of payment for information on Sherlock and is driven back. So in the original unaired pilot, this scene doesn't exist at all. And I when I was going through and watching it this time, I was trying to tune my brain into the Moffat wavelength and work out, like, why does this scene exist at all? Like, it has nothing to do with the plot. Has nothing to do with this murder. The only way that I can see it tying in is at the end, where the guy says, I have a criminal sponsor. The cabbie's like talking about his criminal sponsor, and he says Moriarty. There is a possibility, until the very next scene when it completely ruins this, that we might suspect that this guy is the sponsor and is Moriarty. And there's some tension there of like, oh, we met the bad guy. But I guess unlike other detective stories, when you know who this person is, as you rewatch this scene, you don't get more information or understand more about what's going on or feel smarter for being like, oh, if only I'd seen this earlier. Like, there's nothing... We don't get given anything in this scene that would tell us or indicate to us who this could possibly be. And so, like John, we're told to sit down and shut up while Moffat is like, look at this thing that's interesting. And as I was watching it, this was the first scene where I was actively bored, where I was like, oh, like, because I knew where it was going. I was like, this isn't anything. There's no interest in here. The back and forth didn't do a lot for me. I think except for, there's one line that I really like where, Mycroft's like, talking about Sherlock. He says, he does love to be dramatic. And then John says, well, thank God you're above all that. Really good line. I chuckled. It was really clever. But I just found this scene really unnecessary. It does some stuff which there's some good stuff I'll talk about in a second, but like, it just doesn't... It adds 10 minutes of runtime for seemingly no reason. It doesn't necessarily set up like an interesting location or an interesting like set of problems. It doesn't tell us a lot about future problems. It doesn't suggest anything about future problems. Instead, it kind of implies something interesting could happen later. And that sort of becomes Moffat's MO with this show, is like, I have nothing interesting right now, but later on, this could be really compelling if you keep watching. And that's sort of the purpose of this scene, I think, is to let us know Mycroft could come back later and it could mean something. And it just like, this doesn't go anywhere, which I think is unfortunate, because it could have tied into this episode somehow, or been a real, like, maybe Mycroft has some piece of evidence that could help point them toward the case, and you have to go, well, how does he have that piece of evidence? And then we find out he's the British intelligence. Like, there was a way that this could have been really smartly interwoven, and John might have had to decide, like, do I use that piece of evidence? If I do, Sherlock's going to ask me how I found it. Maybe he lies to Sherlock, and that, like, you can see how this is like such a really sticky, interesting thing that ends up just kind of being an introduction to this character that has nothing to do with the plot. I don't know. What did you think about this little kind of side mission.
So somewhere in the back of my head, I always thought that this scene felt weird. And this time, while I was watching it and actually like paying attention, this was the note that I wrote. It's overly dramatic for no reason and adds nothing to the story. Mm-hmm. Which I think I just repeated what you said there.
It was a lot more eloquent than what I said, yeah.
So that was my note for watching this, but something that you just said that kind of triggered was he is so much like Sherlock, and that could also be part of the point of having this scene, or an argument for having the scene stay in there, is showing that both of the brothers are equally as dramatic, even though Mycroft tries to act like he's above all of that petty drama. Mm-hmm. But he literally kidnapped a dude to bring him to an abandoned warehouse just to meet him. Like, that was it.
Also, but like, I agree that is a really meaningful thing, which is like, hey, they're both dramatic. But then have that in a story where his brother has anything to do with the story that's happening, or have him influence the story in some way.
So like when you dig down to what this actually provided for everything, this feels like such a J.J. Abrams thing, where it was just a twist. Yeah. To introduce someone you think is a villain, and then it turns out not to be a villain, and then it doesn't have any impact on the story after you viewed it that one time. Because the first time I saw this, I loved it. I was like, we just met Moriarty. This was awesome. That was a beautiful introduction for Moriarty. I loved it. And then I found out, oh, that wasn't Moriarty. Oh, that's so cool. That wasn't him. And then we have this another, super smart guy, and oh, Sherlock has a brother, and all this is really cool. But after that first time of, oh, this was awesome, it's like, what is the point? Just like you said.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It sucks, man. Like, it's unfortunate.
Like, really, maybe the only positive thing is something you had said before, was we see a little bit more about John's character, and we see him like immediately flirt with the girl in there.
Yeah, I like that. I like that Mycroft points out like that his hand isn't trembling. That's actually something that is like a useful thing that you can learn and use in your real life, which is that people used to high pressure situations have a better ability to modulate blood pressure, so they tend to shake less. So if you see people that are like really like have really like high intensity jobs where like they're in lawyers and things like that, they have really good control of their blood pressure in those moments, and so they're less likely to tremble. There's just like a thing that like, and this is what the original stories did, is they would teach you stuff you could use. Like the first Sherlock Holmes short story teaches you how to like work out somebody's height based on like the shoe print that they have. Like there's some really interesting stuff you learn from that. This is one of the few things that is like actually applicable. Like, as we said, the smartphone thing, complete bullshit. The wedding ring thing, complete bullshit. The coat and the suitcase thing, we never get to learn that. This is one of the few takeaways of like, oh, this is useful information that I can take away into my real life.
I mean, the scene does give us some useful stuff, but the argument is just whether it's enough useful dialogue and enough useful exposition to warrant that screen time, because we find out the reach that this guy has because he has the notes from John's therapist.
That's right.
Then he immediately like deduces the same as Sherlock, that John is not actually sick. All this is psychosomatic. So getting all of that information right off the bat could be seen as helpful. Additionally, as we see later, Mycroft is supposed to be so smart. What if this entire scene was on purpose, because this is the trigger for John going back to his hotel and getting his gun? If he didn't have that gun, he would not have been able to protect Sherlock.
But Sherlock texting him that makes him go back and get the gun, because Sherlock says could be dangerous. That's why he goes to get the gun.
He says that could be dangerous while John is literally in the middle of being kidnapped. So Sherlock saying that doesn't change anything. He's already been kidnapped. So I think it was the kidnapping that made him go back and get the gun, because he's like, well, this is not happening again. I'm going to be prepared next time.
Man, you're being very generous. I guess that's possible, yes.
I don't know if they... I keep saying this. I don't know if they planned this, but...
You cut this scene. Like, you cut this... They added this... This wasn't in the on-air pilot. They added this in to put Mark Gatiss in there because he was the co-creator and they wanted to set up his character. That's all. In my opinion, that's what this is doing. And you just cut it. Like, it adds nothing. It makes it needlessly kind of long. It's bad.
It's also difficult because I love his portrayal of that character. So any screen time that he gets, I always love his scenes in there.
Yeah.
Although this is one of the ones that, like you said, you could cut, and if you can cut a scene and it doesn't change the plot, then obviously it should be cut. But that's just kind of heartbreaking to take away something that you really like.
That's your job as a writer, is you have to kill your darlings. That's what Stephen King always talks about. You got to kill your fucking darlings. You got to be disciplined in that way.
And kind of something to point out while we're here talking about it is the woman who's kidnapped him, like never makes eye contact and is constantly texting the whole time. And just to point it out now, because it kind of comes up later, when he says, "Please don't tell your boss where you took me," because he's going back to his apartment to get the gun, and she like shakes her head, and he's like, "You already told him, didn't you?" And she's like, "Oh yeah." So the implication is that the person she's texting is her boss, and she's got this running dialogue with him.
Yeah.
So that kind of comes up later at the very end of the episode, but I wanted to point that out now while we're looking at it.
It does, but in service of, again, absolutely nothing. So it's like the attention to detail is good, and it's something that we're going to start to lose, I think, the longer we go in. So basically what happens next is that John gets home and Sherlock asks him to text the message. What happened at Lauriston Gardens? I must have blacked out. 22 Northumberland Street, please come. To Jennifer Wilson's phone. Sherlock then retrieves a small pink suitcase from the kitchen and opens it, adding sarcastically to a surprised John that despite the suitcase and the message, he is not the killer. We get a brief explanation of Sherlock's process of searching dump sites, but that her phone is missing. Sherlock explains a serial adulterer would be careful where she leaves her phone, so it is possible the killer has it on purpose or by mistake. And John realizes he's just texted the killer. And so again, the adulterer thing becomes like a central plot point, and it's still a bullshit deduction. Things I like in this scene, I really like the he's got the 3-patch problem. Now, I like this because it's cute, but I also want to call out how much of a Moffatism this is. This for me, this is like my underlying Moffat moment for this fucking whole episode. So Moffat does this thing with references where he'll deliver a reference in such a way that if you're smart enough to understand what he's doing, you'll be like, oh my god, that's so cool. And if you don't understand what's happening, it just doesn't register at all. And he does it constantly. There's so many examples in Doctor Who that I can't even begin to list them. In two of his episodes, including his finale as a showrunner, he has a Dalek called Rusty, which is a reference to Russell T Davies, the previous showrunner. Like, that's his kind of style of reference. And it sucks. And this is, for me, like, I'm going to introduce a recurring segment as we go on, which is like, there is always a Moffat moment in every episode, and this for me is that, with the 3-patch problem. For those who haven't read the original stories, Sherlock used to smoke a pipe, and then he would have like 2 or 3 pipe problems, and then he would, have the cocaine pipe for really hard problems. And it's that kind of reference of like, if you know what it is, it's clever and adds nothing, and if you don't recognize it, it just doesn't register. But like, it doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't. You don't go, oh, I understand so much more about it now. It only comes back in the fucking Mind Palace episode that is that special that's back in time. But again, in service of nothing. So that's my, like, I just wanted to call it out. It happens. I get what you're doing, Steve. I hate it. What do you think of this little moment here where John maybe thinks that Sherlock's the killer, or maybe he doesn't think that in the suitcase? What's your vibe on this scene?
Okay, let's back all the way up to where John gets out of the kidnapper's car and then goes to the front door, because there's something really interesting there that I think they changed after this episode.
Okay.
He doesn't have a key. He reaches up and grabs the knocker and hits it twice, and then it cuts up to inside. So he has to knock for Mrs. Hudson to let him in. If you'll rewind back to where he and Sherlock first go to view the apartment, Sherlock also knocks on the knocker for Mrs. Hudson to let him in because he doesn't have a key. So in this first pilot, they don't have a key to the door. They have to knock for her to let them in. But every time after this, they just open the door. And I thought that was a really interesting just swap in, the filmmaking and how they were portraying these things. And they were like, well, we don't want to always have the characters just sitting there and waiting for Mrs. Hudson to let them in. That doesn't seem right.
That's true.
But anyway, it was just something that kind of tagged as just kind of unusual to me. the the next thing that I thought was really odd was talking about the patch, the three patch problem, and trying to figure out why it was a three patch problem. Like, I do not understand where the complexity is, because he has already figured this out and it was not that confusing. He knows that the criminal has the phone and they're going to call the phone. They're going to make the criminal come to a specific address. That's it. What else is he?
Because it's a reference. That's the whole
Okay.
reason. That's
So-
that's the only reason it's in there is because it's a reference.
But take the reference and put it to an actual difficult problem, because there's many of them throughout the series.
Couldn't be
And-
done. Couldn't be done because Steve thought of it and he went, "That'd be cool. I should put that in here."
Because like he could have at the very least just one patch. Why do you have a patch? I didn't know you smoked. Oh, I don't normally smoke, but this is a one patch problem. You could have introduced it like that, and
Could have
then
come back
later
later,
on,
yeah.
we just see him constantly slapping on more patches, and then maybe there's like 50 on him at one point. I don't know.
Yeah. So you get what I'm saying with, like, this is the type of thing he does where, and it will always stick out to you like that because you'll always go, wait, why is this here? And then if you understand the reference, you go, oh, but it shouldn't
But-
be here. Like,
But the interesting thing is that upon first viewing, you think it's as complicated as he is portraying it to be, because like basically the writer is telling you this is extremely complicated. I am showing you via the character needing all of this excess nicotine. Like, that is how complicated this is, and you have to be super smart to figure this out. And then as an audience member, if you actually think about it and you're like, well, no, it's just a phone. You call the phone, you set up a meeting. That's it. It's not complicated. So it's an easy, cheap way for the writer to think everything is more complicated than it is if you just have a character blatantly say, this is complicated.
that's probably I know exactly what you mean. And I mean, Stephen will do this throughout the rest of the series. It's probably a good opportunity to talk a little bit about like what detective fiction is, because we haven't really addressed that yet, and I'm sure it'll kind of come up continually through the series as this show changes and shifts genres. One of the things, like the kind of secret source of the Sherlock Holmes stories and detective mysteries in general, is that the detective has the same kind of information you do, and they make a connection that you could have made but didn't think to because you didn't kind of look at the world in a particular way. The coolest thing about the Sherlock Holmes stories is that you could have solved the mysteries before him if only you had thought to look at the problem in a different light. And when you do solve it before him, you feel really good. You're like, oh my God, I think I've worked it out. And that's like one of the best things about, like, say, like The Mentalist or Elementary or like, shows like that where they're really keenly interested in the mystery part of it, is you get to this opportunity. So I want to read to you from Marty Roth's book, which is a 1995 breakdown called Foul and Fair Play, Reading Genre Classics in Detective Fiction. I'm probably going to reference this book a lot in this series. Roth read 138 detective stories as part of this analysis of the genre. So I just want to read you a little bit of a piece where he's talking about... he's exploring like what a detective story is and like what its anatomy is, and he talks about a mode of reading that we approach these stories with which I think is really like representative of what you're describing. So I'll just read you this little passage here, and then I'd love to know your thoughts on it. So, quote, "On the other hand, detective fiction is charged with making extraordinary, though artificial, demands on the reader. Anthony Trollope complained of the reading program in the sensational novel, 'I can never lose the taste of the construction. The author seems always to be warning me to remember that something happened at exactly 2:30 on Tuesday morning, or that a woman disappeared from the road just 15 yards beyond the 4th milestone.' And Chandler commented scornfully on the similar situation in analytic detective fiction. 'There may be one somewhere that would really stand up under close scrutiny. It would be fun to read, even if I did have to go back to page 47 to refresh my memory about what exactly the time the second gardener potted the prize-winning Terose begonia. Is detective fiction a confusing mixture of the relevant, irrelevant, and misleading that one cannot read at all? This is the central question, it seems, of the genre." End quote. And so the key point that Roth is pulling out there is that detective fiction asks the reader to pay attention to specific details, not knowing what will be relevant later on. And so the fiction itself, like the construction of the fiction, must dote on specific details that may not be relevant or may be relevant. And that's where it can become kind of difficult, right? Where here's a crime, here are the clues. Did you notice the clues and interpret them the right way? Did you understand their meaning? And so to your point about like, is this a 3-patch problem, makes us go, is this a complicated problem that needs to be solved? What should we be thinking about? And the question of what should we be thinking about in this scene is like, I don't know. The last time we saw him, he just yelled about pink and left the room talking about a suitcase. And so where it's asking us and calling us to pay attention to details, it's like in this sequence, like what are the details that we would be conjuring up as the reader to say like, okay, well, what possibly could Sherlock be working through that we should be thinking about? The answer is like not much of anything, that because he's kind of solved it all and we don't have access to the same resources he does. So I guess what Roth is getting at is the challenge of detective fiction is how do you dote on the right details at the right times, and then how do you call them back into memory and remind the reader of the important details? And I just think this scene really fumbles that because it distracts you with the like, here's the 3-patch thing, and you go, oh, this was really complicated, and the solve is really simple. And so you're right, there is a lack of consistency between those two things that I think rears its head here and makes this kind of jarring.
I'd be kind of curious to take someone who is a little bit versed in the same kind of deductive reasoning that Sherlock specializes in, because people in real life can do the same kind of stuff. It's not completely made up. But take it and have them view the show up until this point, or up until the point where Sherlock yells pink, because there's actually enough shown in there where you could solve pretty much everything except specifically who the villain is. Mm-hmm. So it's not as outlandish as you might think for any normal person to solve this, but this goes back to something that we were kind of talking about in a text where you were talking about how you really like those stories where the audience member can figure out the problem even before the hero does. But my argument was that we can't figure it out before Sherlock because then he's not special. And that's the entire point of his character, is that he is this elevated character who is above us. He is supposed to be more intelligent than us. We cannot figure it out before him because then that completely breaks his character of being better. That's his entire thing. And I had mentioned how it almost feels like it's a sort of like deity worship, the level to which he is elevated, mm-hmm. the way that he figures out stuff in a way that the audience can't even see. It's like he's like omniscient almost, because
he gets magic powers basically after this episode. Yeah.
However you want to talk about it, whether we're talking about like Gandalf style stuff or actual deity type stuff, but it's depicted the same way as Sherlock. He just sees stuff and magically knows, and it's a completely different type of show for the audience to be able to see the same thing that he sees, because I think that's one reason that a whole lot of people really enjoy this show, is because they're watching someone who's watching someone above. And a lot of people really like thinking, especially back in the olden days of the Greeks and stuff, they loved stories about the gods and they wanted to see people better than them perform. And it's I think it might be kind of the same thing here with Sherlock. And that's one reason that we love him so much, is because we can't see what he's thinking. We can't grasp the brilliance of his being, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, which is fine, but like, don't make the show Sherlock then. Just call it something else. Like, don't use the one piece of Western fiction that is about specifically details and solving problems and puzzles. Like, it is the very essence of that as a concept. And so, like, I have no problem with that as a show, right? Like, with Moffat taking this idea and being like, here is a show about someone who's uber smart, let's watch him do uber smart things. But you can't have it both ways and be like, it's a detective story with fucking Sherlock Holmes and also this other complete framework that he's pulls from Doctor Who of like the super special space-time magic guy. I think that's where the friction is.
At the same time, from what I remember in one of my videos, I did a like very quick analysis of all of the most commonly portrayed characters, and like Doctor Who was one of the longest running characters. Bond, Superman, they've had like 36 actors play each character, and Holmes has been running for so long. that it has such a wide variety of portrayals, and given that fact, is it really that grievous a sin for this version to be, different? Like, and I love coming back to Marvel Zombies as an example of this kind of thing. Like, that does not fit within the MCU. It does not fit within Marvel as a whole. It's a complete side story. We do not want it to be the core story. I do not want Steve Rogers to be a zombie perpetually. It's a fun side story. Maybe this version of Sherlock is not something that I want, because I actually like the idea of going back and seeing the older versions of Sherlock, and kind of thinking about it's so different than this. Like, I don't know another way to think to describe it as other than this Sherlock is elevated to a level of some kind of deity, where the other Sherlock is just a normal human who is deciphering clues. And
Yes.
they're to me, they seem like two completely different things, but that doesn't necessarily mean to me that this version is just completely broken, because it's just a different version of the character, and they could each have their strengths or their weaknesses,
I think that's true. The challenge this show has is the way it frames its own text, is that it frames itself in such a way that, like, if he were just a god, which is what he becomes by the end of the show would stop saying pay attention to all of these details and look at and call attention to all of these facts and these different bits and pieces through its production effects and through its dialogue and through its literal structural framing. Like, it still adheres to so much of the structural framework of what a detective story is, and it uses this production style to dote on details that make you go, oh, well, surely this is related to the crime. And then when it's solved, it's like, well, why was I fucking paying attention to those details? And so I think it's at odds, because I agree. I think there is a valid version of this where it's like he's just a dude that has access to stuff we don't. But the framing, the narratives, and the type of stories it's telling do not, like, they create friction with that as a concept, where it's this character is this one thing and the rest of the story is this whole other thing. And it constantly creates friction and problems where neither thing is allowed to do its job properly, and creates not just logical fallacies, but emotional ones too, where I always struggle in this show at certain points to understand what the purpose of including certain detail or certain scenes is, other than look at how smart Sherlock is, which is a valid reason to have a scene. But then it will undercut it by being like, oh, but if you were paying enough attention, you would have realized this other thing. I'm talking about when we get into the history of the show, but part of the show's appeal was the showrunners throughout its run constantly saying, pay attention to the details. Like, there'll be a rug pull coming up, pay attention to the details, blah, 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 blah. That was the meta text around it. And that was what so much of the engagement with the text was on Tumblr and on the internet, was like theory crafting and like trying to work out, like, well, what's Moriarty's plan? What's the final problem? Like, because of the way it presents itself, it begs you to try and solve certain problems and theorize, and then it just goes, no, fuck you, you don't have access to all the information. And so I think what you're saying is valid. I just think this show isn't doing that, or isn't doing that as successfully as it could, potentially. And maybe as we go through, my opinion will change revisiting it in this format. Like, maybe there are things about it that do work, but certainly I get what you're saying, and I think we should keep that in mind as we keep moving. Because I wonder how much that becomes relevant in the final season, because that kind of becomes the whole show.
Well, to finish off this scene, there's a couple other things that I just thought were really interesting with the whole. We got the 3 patch problem, and then after that, it's like, will you please hand me my phone? And then John's like, what? You called me from halfway across London to come and hand you your phone? Yeah, it's on the counter over there, or whatever. So, like, this doesn't make sense on so many levels that even trying to think through it is confusing. And I think that entire concept of him needing the phone was just a misdirect, because, like we talked about earlier, I think that John's entire point is to be the companion, and Sherlock needs him there to ground him, because you can't text someone from your phone to say, come here, I need you to hand me my phone. Like, that does not mentally track.
Oh, yeah. I forgot that he got that. Oh, God. Okay.
Yeah. So.
Well, no, but does he have John text him from Sherlock's phone or from a different phone?
Well, he said he said bring me the phone or bring me the number. Actually, I think it was bring me the number. The number's on the counter there, and text it from your phone. So maybe John texted from his phone.
John is from his phone because I think Sherlock's
Yeah.
using John's phone for some reason.
But still, either way, the whole thing doesn't make sense because he had access to a phone to text John, and then he didn't have the phone. No matter
God.
what, the scene doesn't
track.
make sense unless the entire point of it was to show that he needs John to ground him.
But what does John do in that scene that helps ground him? He uses John to text a killer. Like,
Yeah,
John doesn't like.
I think the premise is just that physically having him there like stabilizes him emotionally or something.
So
There's
he's
no
a
visual...
fucking guide dog.
Yes,
Still,
yes.
Like, yeah.
I know. There's no like visual proof of that in the text that we could
That's
actually
very funny.
say, but that's the only interpretation
very
that really
funny.
makes sense because he keeps calling John to come to him
That's very, very
with no
funny to me.
actual.
No reason. He's like, just sit in the corner. So I it's very good.
But then
Well,
the other
speaking of-
thing,
Yeah.
the other thing in this scene that is so memorable is I met one of your enemies. Oh, which one? And
Yeah.
just the super casual way that Sherlock is like, oh yeah, I've got dozens of enemies. Which one are you referring to? And then, oh, your arch enemy. Oh, him. So again, it doesn't have any point to the plot of the story, except that it's intriguing the first time you see it.
Yep.
And I loved it the first time I saw it because I was like, they're talking about Moriarty. This is so awesome. But then after the fact, it doesn't mean anything. So it's just another one of those bait and switch things that adds tension to a scene where maybe they didn't have an easier way to do that actually would, attribute something to the overall plot.
Which is such a shame because there's already things in there that could have been really tense, like the fact that Watson maybe thinks that Sherlock's the killer. Just write the scene about that. It's way more interesting.
Or the fact that Sherlock left him stranded out in the middle of the neighborhood. Like he could have been super pissed about that.
And that could be really interesting character dynamic and growth and friction, right?
Yeah,
Like-
and for Sherlock to legitimately not comprehend why that's a problem, because then
Yes.
that would show that his mental disconnect there.
Instead,
So-
it's the Moffat school of tension where it's implication of something interesting, and it says, "Hey, see if you can work this out." And by the time that you're about to work it out, Steve goes, "Actually, it's this other thing. Fuck you." And that is like such a because what he's doing is he's like, "No, I'm smarter than you are. I know what's going on. You need to keep watching to see what's going on." And it's this trick to keep you engaged and on the hook, right? Where you never have to reveal anything. You constantly bait and switch and bait and switch and bait and switch, and every time you bait and switch, you reveal another mystery box, right? So J.J. Abrams' thing of like, keep watching next week to find out what happens. Keep watching next week to find out what happens. Like it's that exact kind of thing. It's just endlessly frustrating.
So looking back at this scene, it's kind of interesting to see the pose that Sherlock is doing. He has his hands steepled underneath his chin, and then there's a light right above him that has this like soft angelic glow down on top of him. And it just brings back that same thing I was talking about with the whole deity thing, because the way that this is framed just immediately gives that idea that this is like a wise monk who is doing brilliant things and we're all just lucky to be in his presence. I mean,
Oh my god! The imagery is so much.
yeah, like there's an overhead shot where he has his eyes peacefully closed and his hands clasped together.
Buddy,
Like-
it's rough. So much. It's so much. It's so much. I can't. I've never noticed that before. That's a lot. God damn it, Stephen. Okay, we got to get a little wiggle on to get to the interesting stuff. So, speaking of stuff that makes no sense and doesn't progress the plot, Sherlock and John head to an Italian restaurant where they have a bizarre conversation about sexuality. Sherlock then ponders that the killer must have a way of going unnoticed during his crimes. At that moment, a taxi stops in front of 22 Northumberland Street, the place where Sherlock baited the killer to go to, and the passenger in the back looks out at them and makes eye contact with Sherlock, but doesn't get out of the cab. Sherlock and John take chase, zigging and zagging through side streets and alleys to cut off the cab, but then realize it's just a tourist. God, I get what they were going for with the like luring him to across the restaurant and stuff. and it lets our guys have their first queer baiting conversation, which is just going to keep happening, and we'll talk about more and more, and I fucking hate it. Which, the cabbie turns up, which is fine. I think a simple reshuffling of events just makes this better, where the police would have ravaged the flat before Holmes and Watson get back, which could add to some immediacy, where it's I don't know. I just think the fact that they still have this whole conversation and they go out on this fucking chase and they come back and Mrs. Hudson's like, oh my God, do you want to bloody believe what's happened? I think there is a way to resequence this that makes it a lot more intriguing and interesting, and this just isn't it. I don't know. People fucking. This is a scene where you can tell that they were we need to get Tumblr on side. Let's have a moment where these characters could be maybe gay. Let's queerbait the shit out of this, and then just do that for the rest of the fucking show for no reason. I find it really disingenuous, but there's some fun dialogue. I like the end of the scene where they're leaning against the wall trying to catch their breath, and John says, "Okay, that was ridiculous. That was the most ridiculous thing I've ever done." And then Sherlock says, "And you invaded Afghanistan." And then John says, "That wasn't just me." It's pretty funny. It's a bit tone deaf, but I thought that was really funny. I don't know. What's your take on this whole cul-de-sac?
Well, there's a whole lot of stuff throughout this entire episode that I feel like they're just doing to show how emotionally weird Sherlock is. And so much of the stuff that they talk about at that table in the restaurant wasn't really about relationships. It was just showing that Sherlock doesn't understand relationships. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't understand, at one point Sherlock actually does a double take at John, and he's like, wait, is he hitting on me or is he not hitting on me? I legitimately can't tell.
Yep.
And so then he starts to actually have a conversation with him, and then that felt so natural to me because he is just outright saying, I'm not sure if you're hitting on me, but in case you are, I have to let you know that I'm flattered. Which was also interesting because he never cares about hurting people's feelings, but he immediately is trying to save John's feelings. So that's a bit of showing that he's actually a little bit, at least he cares about John. He would not do that same thing for Donovan or Anderson or anybody like that,
Interesting.
So that's kind of one interesting thought. And then the line that I had said earlier was after they finish their run. Oh, wait, another thing that's about Sherlock's emotional stuff is the restaurant owner. When he's like, this man saved my life. Anything you want is for free. And then we think, oh, he must have done something really amazing for him. And no, it just turns out that he proved that the guy was being a criminal in a different part of town than where he was being accused of being a criminal in.
What?
Yeah. So, he was accused of a murder on the west end of town, and Sherlock proved he was robbing a store in the north end of town. Oh. So then he got off the charge for the murder, right? But the idea that Sherlock does not care that this man is a criminal, he just wanted to solve the mystery.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so it's another example of Sherlock's mentality. So the entire scene kind of feels forced in many ways and feels like it doesn't prove a point, but at least they tried. At least they had a plan, yes. And they were trying to do something with the writing for the scene.
Interesting that you say that, because that links into Mrs. Hudson, where he's like, I helped her with her husband's murder trial or whatever, and Watson's like, oh, you helped him get off, and Sherlock's like, no, I made sure that he got executed or whatever. It's like, that moral ambiguity. But then, this is what drives me fucking nuts, is that moral ambiguity is such an interesting core of Sherlock as a character, as a concept. One of the things that makes him really interesting as a detective, as opposed to the police, is that he does really dodgy shit all the time. There are several short stories where he's just working for bad guys trying to solve a problem because he's interested in the problem. The Irene Adler case, he's working for a guy who is doing the wrong thing, who is trying to blackmail Adler to get her to give him back, exposing photos. He's working for the bad guy. And the way that this show handles it is by constantly implying that Sherlock is morally ambiguous and then basically never showing us that. There is one scene later on, which we'll talk about in a subsequent episode, where he commits violence on somebody. I won't say what, because I don't want to spoil where the show ends up going. But he does violence to somebody, and it's the only time that he actually is largely immoral. Otherwise, he's either just ignorant of social mores or just rude, or it's implied that he's morally ambiguous. But this Sherlock Holmes is a godlike hero. Like, he is heroic in his behaviors throughout, I think. But no, I think this is really good characterization. I just don't think it ends up carrying through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the last thing with that scene was when they get back, and the whole point of that, well, one of the points of it being that John forgot that he was crippled. He forgot his cane. He was doing all the running, and that cured him of his trauma. Mm-hmm. But then we have that same line of dialogue come back when John says, "What were we doing at the restaurant?" And Sherlock says, "Proving a point."
Proving a point, yeah.
And then the doorbell rings, and the guy is standing there with a cane to give it back to John. And that was the second time that we had that line of proving a point.
That's because that's what I thought was that's why I thought the original one when we first talked about it was that. Like, where he's like, what, like, why am I here? Proving a point, which is like, you're using the cane now, but later you won't be, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
But I don't know, because the first time it just did not feel like it was John. It's like John was like, what am I doing here in regards to the body? And Sherlock says, proving a point. It just doesn't track with this scene. But I think what you're saying is what they intended. That because there's no chance that these two lines of dialogue exist in the same thing, mm-hmm. being so similar, you know? So the writers did this on purpose. What were they trying to communicate? And it's more likely that what you're saying is true. But they just, I don't know how they've failed to properly communicate. Yeah.
Which is such an obvious, like, I don't know. It's weird. Like, yeah. It'd be easy, right? Sherlock says proving a point, and then he looks deliberately at John's cane or something, right? Like, it's really easy to make that follow through. I don't know.
All right. So then we're up to the room getting ransacked, right?
Yeah. So they get back, and Mrs. Hudson greets the pair. She's panicked because the police are upstairs. So Lestrade and his guys are pretending to conduct a drug bust. John laughs at the drug excuse, and Sherlock tells him to shut up, hinting at some kind of history with drugs. Anderson pushes for Sherlock's arrest, but Lestrade is interested in Sherlock's take on the crime. Rachel, the police have learned, was the name of Wilson's stillborn daughter, dead for 14 years. Sherlock reveals his real inability to connect with people by asking why someone would think of their daughter in their last moments. Mrs. Hudson enters and tells Sherlock that his taxi has arrived. Sherlock yells at everyone to shut up, and he realizes Wilson did not lose her phone. She planted her phone on the killer. As she did not have a laptop, the word she tried to scratch into the floor was Rachel, which is the password to her smartphone's Find a Friend type thing, which enabled those who knew it to activate the GPS and discover where the phone was located. This is our, like, solve of the great mystery of this case, which is why did she write Rachel? This is, like, probably the biggest solve that we see and is the key to Sherlock working out the identity of the killer. One thing before we dive into the scene properly, Sherlock is saying to Lestrade, he's like, I'm clean. And, he shows him the nicotine patches. And then Lestrade also has nicotine patches. I noticed that for the first time in this one. And I think, like I was saying before, the relationship between these two characters is, to me, the most compelling in the show. Because they just have, like, such a deep similarity in this complicated kind of way. I really like their dynamic. And I like that sort of... he's like, I don't even smoke anymore. And Lestrade's like, me neither. I don't know. There's a really great mutual respect there that Sherlock does not have for Watson or for anybody else. I think it's really cool.
At first, I thought that was like really, really contrived, and I did not like Lestrade having those on his arm because it was not established previously in any way, and Sherlock uses them to think better to solve a problem. So it doesn't make any sense for Lestrade to have them on. But then I realized, like, what if he literally has those on to deal with Sherlock?
Yeah.
And, like, he doesn't normally need them, but they just give him the patience to deal with Sherlock, which is kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's cool. I want to call out... we'll talk about the solve in a second, but I want to call out the worst fucking line in this entire TV program so far, which is... Donovan or Anderson or whoever, someone is like, you're a bloody psychopath. And he goes, he goes, I'm a high functioning sociopath. Do your research. I have never cringed so hard in my entire life. This line sucks. This just sucks. Like, 2010, I would have fucking loved this and been like, that's so cool. Look at how self-aware he is. But this just sucks to watch. Like, it's so snide and like, aren't I the smartest guy in the room? And I'm like, shut the fuck up, Sherlock. It sucks to experience. I hate it.
Okay, so I am you in 2010 mentally. I have now learned this.
Ugh, awful.
'Cause
Awful. I was like, God damn, 16-year-old me would have been like, that's so cool. Like, he fucking owned those nerds. Shut the fuck up, Sherlock.
Yeah.
Shut the fuck up.
I do remember loving that line more, like, whatever, 5 years ago. And the past couple times I've heard it, I'm like, that just sounds like too much. Like, there's too much ego in it, or something. I don't know. But the first couple times I heard it, I was like, that's awesome. I loved it.
I think it's the delivery that puts it over the line for me. Do
But,
research. Shut up. It's the way I don't know. The delivery sucks.
But being combined with several other things that made that scene so interesting, the fact that he keeps telling John to shut up, you could take it one of two ways. Either he could be saying, because it's not like he's going to be outed if John keeps talking. Like, everyone else in the room knows that he's a druggie. So why would John continue to ask questions, keep making Sherlock say, shut up, you know? So the only two options I see were that if John keeps talking about it, that's somehow going to lead the cops to actually finding the drugs that Sherlock hid, or Sherlock really likes this guy, so he doesn't want to diminish himself in front of him by outright admitting that he's a druggie. So I don't know what the writers were aiming for, but either way, the implications are kind of interesting.
Is it possible that like he wants John to shut up because the more John talks, the more rope he's going to give Anderson and Donovan to get a one-up on Sherlock? Like, it's like a power thing, maybe. Or
they could just be... They may have been sooner playing into what happens like 30 seconds after that, where he starts yelling at everyone in the room to be quiet so that he could think. I don't think that's what they were going for right then.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really come across clearly at all what they were intending by that. It plays more like he's saying, you don't know what you're talking about, be quiet because you're embarrassing yourself. That's kind of how it plays.
Oh, okay. I could see that.
But it also doesn't track for his character to care what other people think, or to care if another person will be emotionally embarrassed. That doesn't track for Sherlock unless we are starting to... Because this is the second time in this episode that we have seen Sherlock care about John's emotional reaction. The first time being in the restaurant where he tries to tell John that you're attractive and I would be interested in you if I were gay. And this is a second time where he's trying to protect John emotionally. So we could see that this is character development on the part of Sherlock, but it doesn't feel intentional enough to think that the writers did it on purpose. Maybe they did.
I like that reading the most, though, because I think that it's like, it's Sherlock protecting John in front of everybody else, being like, I don't want you to look bad in front of them because I need them to take you seriously, kind of thing.
Maybe.
Because, you know, his antagonistic relationship with Anderson and Donovan, they can't believe that he would have a friend. So maybe it's part of that, of being like, no, like I do. Like I promise I do.
Then the next really interesting thing was, like, one of my favorite lines was telling Donovan to shut up, or not Anderson, telling Anderson to shut up and turn around. Like, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but I love the idea. I love the idea that knowing someone is looking at you throws you off. So you're like, don't look at me. You can't even look at me. Because, like, people have done that in real life. Like, somebody has done that in real life, you know?
I could see being in a situation where I'm like, I need you specifically to not look at me because you're fucking putting me off.
Yeah. And like, even during this, like, sometimes when I'm trying to concentrate on thinking about something, like right now I'm looking at a speaker because it's easier to concentrate looking at that than trying to get into your head watching me, which is a really fascinating, we've done a little bit of work in psychology at the office, because like we're in sales and we're selling to customers, and it's like trying to figure out how to interact with the customer. And there's something really fascinating that in any two-person conversation, there's actually six people. There's me talking to you, me thinking about me talking to you, me thinking about your reaction of me talking to you. Then there's you listening to me, you thinking about how you're listening to me, you thinking about your interpretation of how I'm thinking about you listening to me. And like all of those people are, it's really weird to think about.
I mean, it gets even weirder in this format, because then I'm also like, I'm thinking about pacing and timing and segments, and like I'm also being like, okay, well, this would be a good juncture to move into this kind of research part of discussion I'd like to address, and I'm like, well, how do I make sure that we move at a correct clip so that we don't belabor anything for too. So it's like even more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I've skipped over 63 things already that I wanted to talk about. Yeah. Like, what do we do here?
That's how it works. Like, you just have to find the way to be like, what is the most interesting? But that's the whole point of this, right? Is like, I think with a show like this, its particular imagination of how social interactions work is so stylized in a particular kind of way that it's almost hard to abstract it directly to real life, right? Where it's like, well, do people behave like this? No, because no one is as smart as Sherlock. Okay, but we could see some of these behaviors being representative of actually happening. And it becomes really hard to then go, well, what feels realistic? And so instead what we do is we go, does it feel right emotionally for this character? And does it feel right for this scene? Instead of saying, could a real person do this? And that's part of the challenge with fiction. It's kind of why I think CinemaSins is like the biggest crime against the way people think about fiction and cinema and TV and media in general, is like something being illogical or a logical inaccuracy isn't always a bad thing. There are things that are like, that have logical fallacies in them that feel emotionally true and make sense, right? Like go and watch Twin Peaks. That thing is full of like weird anachronisms, but it's so much more focused on the emotionality of it. And one of Sherlock's biggest challenges, I think, as a show, which we've already alluded to, is how do you get away with scenes like this where characters talk like this and do things like this, but then focus so much on the specific clues and solving crimes in a realistic kind of way that then becomes its own fucking worst enemy, like its own kind of snake eating its tail of like, well, it's realistic and the details are important, but also you could never solve it yourself. And like you can start to see how it gets to the level of absurdity where it does. Like this is the seeds of that in scenes like this where I'm like, that is funny that he made Anderson turn around. But then it's even better because Lestrade, quite beleaguered, goes, everybody shut up and Anderson, turn your back. And like Lestrade buys into it. He's not happy about it. He doesn't think it's funny, but he's like, well, we have to do this to get a result. And so it grounds it nicely. Like it feels more realistic for that reason, maybe.
Well, another really interesting thought that I just had based off what you were talking about was that so many times when the audience members think that something doesn't track rationally, that a character isn't reacting like a real world person would, that so many of those times it's because just you are not that person. That doesn't mean that those people don't exist. And I have two examples that I literally did that people just do not believe, but they're both like literally scenes that Sheldon Cooper did that are me. Like there's one scene where Sheldon is picking apart a hamburger and how a hamburger is made, and I have literally had an argument with one of my best friends about his meat to bun to condiment ratio on his hamburgers, line for line. That is what is in the show, right? And then there's another time when like I came back from a trip and I walk into my bedroom and I'm like yelling out to my 4 roommates and I'm like, hey, who was in here? And then all of them are like, how did you know? And I'm like, the angle of my lightsaber. Angle of my lightsaber's wrong. Someone was in here. Someone touched my lightsaber.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
So the point being that doesn't seem natural. Like watching Sheldon, so many people are like, that is so made up. That's not real. That can't exist. And to me, I'm like, this is me. This is so similar to me. I understand it perfectly and it tracks logically. So it's just really interesting talking about like CinemaSins, like you mentioned, like so many things that they would say are not realistic are just not realistic from their point of view.
Interesting. I think what we're going to find is like the end of this season, we'll have a lot more to talk about with that particular topic about like perception and reality, because it comes a really prescient point in the kind of that season finale. So I guess to sort of talk about what happens next. So, I mean, the solve with Rachel is pretty clever. Like him going, hey, that's the name of the passcode. I think that's pretty clever. Like the fact that we all know GPSs exist on phones. This is like not an unreasonable solve. It also sets up a really important piece of world building for this universe, which is that passcodes on phones are 5 characters long. This, for some reason, is a crucial plot point in season 2. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
This becomes really important later on for some reason. So it sets that up nicely, which is fine. So without telling anybody what the GPS says, Sherlock gets up and John sits down. At this point, Sherlock's already left the room. So Sherlock leaves the room with the cabbie who's waiting patiently. As the police search the room, Sherlock basically concludes the cabbie fits the profile and has the phone. So he gets into the cab and is driven at gunpoint to an abandoned school. I want to say 2 things here, and then I want to talk about I want to get us to the school first, and then we can talk about the cabbie's plan. This scene works way better in the unaired version of this pilot, where Sherlock and John are like fucking around trying to solve the crime, and it gets Sherlock caught and drugged. And as he's drugged, that's where we get the hint of his past, where the cabbie's like, I use really high dose. You have a really high tolerance. You know, maybe Sherlock Holmes has a problem with drugs kind of thing. And it's a better version than the police being like, you used to use drugs, didn't you, Sherlock? And he's like, but I don't use drugs anymore. It was a much more subtle kind of version of that. So I want to ask a question, and then I just want to kind of frame the next little sequence so we can talk about the ending. Why does Sherlock get in the cab?
Okay, so the cabbie actually tells him, if you get in the cab with me, I will tell you how I killed all of those people. Yep. Because I didn't force it, they killed themselves. Yes. They took the drugs willingly to kill themselves. And the cabbie says, I will turn myself in. If you go and get the coppers, I will not run. I will give myself over, but I will never tell you how I got those people to kill themselves.
Correct.
So Sherlock gets in the cab purely from his own intellectual curiosity.
Yes. Okay, so I wanted to establish that really clearly. So the cabbie, in the cab ride, the cabbie admits that he knows Sherlock from his website and was warned about him by his sponsor. Meanwhile, John, standing next to the laptop, hears it beep as the GPS updates, with the location of the school when they arrive, and he kind of dashes off. In the initial reading of this, when I first watched it, I assumed that Mycroft was the sponsor, like that he was Moriarty, probably similar to like what you had. I want to set up the scene in the schoolroom, and then we can talk a bit about like what all is happening with the cabbie and his plan and how all this is working. So, unless there's anything you had on the cab ride of that particular sequence that was worth doting
on. There were a couple things. We actually do see Sherlock solving the stuff at that moment, finding out stuff about the cabbie. We see a point of view shot of the stuff behind the cabbie's ear, the shaving cream, and we see the picture. So we see that Sherlock is already gathering clues to find stuff out about the cabbie. So it's not later this omniscient thing where he just knows stuff. We're actually learning it alongside him. Mm-hmm. And that's an argument that I'll make for a lot of this episode, that we can figure out a lot of this. And one really interesting thing that I did not notice until this time was that it is so heavily hinted just via the filmmaking that a taxi driver was the criminal.
Yep. It's in it's in those first scenes. Did you rewatch the first 3?
That's what I was going to say, is each one of them had a cab in the initial thing, mm-hmm. and the word taxi was said 5 times before this dude even shows up to reveal that it was a taxi. So we see 3 of them, and the word is said 5 times. And I think that Mrs. Hudson even says the word, like, your taxi driver's here. She says it like another 3 times or something. So, like, it is subconsciously at least hammered into the audience that taxi, taxi, taxi. Much the same that him yelling out pink, like, we should be able to jump to, like, what did he talk about before that? He said the word suitcase 6 times before that. We should be able to think pink suitcase. Oh, okay.
Yep. I mean, similar to In the Flat when he's like, Rachel, and then they all just stare at him and he's like, oh my god, what it must be like to live in your brains so bloody dull, you bloody big dummies. And then it's like, the whole time you're supposed to be like, Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. Yeah, similar idea.
Anything else in the cab? We had some of the best transitions were like in this scene. There's one of like a door opening, like John's in their apartment, and then the door opens to transition to Sherlock in the school. Some beautiful transitions here.
You can really
Very
see them
memorable.
start to nail into the style that's going to become the thing moving forward.
So and then we get some backstory with the cabbie who's how do you know where to all these empty buildings, and taxi drivers always know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so that's interesting as well, is that you get a bit more like his knowledge of London is pretty deep, and that is how he's getting away with it, I guess, or that's kind of the implication.
Now, one thing, although we haven't really gotten into their dialogue, but one thing that moderately has annoyed me with his character is that he pretty blatantly says, "Oh, you're a proper genius," like he is supposed to be a smart dude like Sherlock, maybe not his level, but he's supposed to be a proper genius. We do not see that. All we have is him saying, "I outlived 4 people who played this game. It's a chess match, and I am good at chess, and I could outthink you." So all we have is his word that he is brilliant, but we don't see it. Like, maybe we get a little bit of deductive stuff with him just reading Sherlock's, body language or whatever, but we don't see enough from him that makes me think that he was an inspired villain because of his brilliance.
Yep. And then you find out that, like, what was actually the sponsor that tipped him off to all this stuff, and you're like, so he just wasn't smart. It was somebody else.
I don't know. I do think that the intent for his character was that with every single person that he killed, he did the same thing where he had the bottle, and he either pushed one towards them, or he put one to the left, or he put one to the right, and it just depends on reading the person and seeing their mentality. Are they looking aggressive? Are they withdrawn? Are they left-handed, right-handed? And with all that info, he could tell, and he was still winning his bets. It wasn't 50-50 for him. Yeah. So I could see how he was supposed to be incredibly smart. We just don't get enough of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is just the Princess Bride scene, right? Like, this is just that. Let me set up what happens, and then we can talk a bit about... let's get into the kind of weeds of the way this wraps up. So Sherlock and the cabbie sit face to face in a large study room at the Rollins Kerr Further Education College, where the cabbie challenges Sherlock to a supreme battle of wits to the death. The cabbie puts on the table 2 bottles, each containing a large pill, explaining one is quite harmless, but the other is deadly poison. When Sherlock selects the pill that he deduces to be safe, the cabbie promises that he will eat the other pill at the same time, and they will find out who the proper genius really is and who is a dead man. Sherlock ensures that both bottles are identical, to which the cabbie verifies this fact. Sherlock then deduces the correct choice to make, and the cabbie asks Sherlock for his best game. The cabbie brags that he is not a novice and has already won this game 4 times. He asserts it's not a game of chance at all, but chess, confidently insisting for a second time this is not a matter of chance, but genius. Meanwhile, John enters the building, searching it frantically and calling out for Sherlock, who is busy playing the cabbie's game. Summing up his observations, Sherlock ventures that the game, as the cabbie calls it, is about his children. I really like Sherlock breaking down this stuff, by the way. We'll talk about it in a second. God, okay. So the cabbie confirms that he's been estranged from his children for years and has been told that he is dying. He's got an aneurysm or something that could kill him at any second. He adds that the inheritance he'll leave them is meager. And in that moment, focusing on his children and his morality, the cabbie looks to the pill bottle on his left. Sherlock decides that's where the death is. The cabbie draws a gun to force Sherlock to take the pill, and Sherlock asks for the gun, knowing it's a lighter. As Sherlock gets up to leave, saying he looks forward to the court case, the cabbie asks him if he figured it out. He taunts Sherlock to choose a pill again, to prove that he has superior wits and intellect, deduce the safe pill, saying that Sherlock is driven by boredom and an addiction to thrill-seeking, and is simply unable to resist the challenge. Sherlock explains that he solved the puzzle through child's play. He picks the bottle in front of the cabbie, and they both face each other. Sherlock delays, holding his pill up to the light, inspecting it closely, when a crack shot is fired through a window pane, hitting the cabbie squarely in the chest. Sherlock returns to the cabbie and demands to know if he made the right choice, but the cabbie just smiles. Angrily, Sherlock ruthlessly drives his foot into the cabbie's wounded shoulder, demanding the name of the serial killer's sponsor. In pain, the cabbie screams Moriarty and then dies. This is our kind of like final sequence here where it's kind of this battle of wits. Like I said, I really like Sherlock breaking down the cabbie and making these kind of solves. And you can see the way that it's sort of, the way the cabbie is appreciating how clever Sherlock is and you know, how much he's able to glean from so little detail. The weird thing about this scene, though, is that the actual solve is about the gun. Like, the fact that the gun is a lighter is the real kind of linchpin here. I think that works well, except that we kind of don't. Like, I don't know enough about guns to look at that thing and be like, that's not a gun, that's a lighter. But yeah, I mean, it's still pretty cool. What else? I mean, it also sets up the Sherlock being bored thing, and that he's like a thrill seeker. This becomes his like defining characteristic for about 2 seasons. But otherwise, I think this scene just works really well. It's really tense. It's well written. I like the way that they kind of, him and the cabbie have this sort of tense, there's a terseness there where the cabbie kind of realizes that it's all over. And so it's now just a sort of a game of like, how can he prove to Sherlock he's smarter because he knows he's been caught. I think that stuff works super well. What do you think about this in general as like the kind of finale to this episode?
One problem that I think they inadvertently introduced was the distinction between him being a thrill seeker and him having an unquenchable intellectual curiosity, because it is very easy to interpret that scene of him getting ready to take the pill as not thrill seeking but needing to know.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's very much more in line with what his character that we've seen so far, because like he did not care about taking the pill because he solved the mystery, he figured out everything, and he got up to walk out of the room. Like, he still could have taken a pill at that point if he was into thrill seeking. It wasn't until the cabbie again pointed out, you don't know if you're right until you take the pill. So it was the lack of knowledge that drew him. It wasn't the thrill seeking, even though that's what the cabbie was talking about. So I don't know if that was like inefficient writing, where they had the cabbie focusing on the thrill seeking, and so they're making the audience think that Sherlock is a thrill seeker when he's not. He's a seeker of the unknown, and that's what he was more interested in. Was he was willing to risk death just to know if he was right or wrong.
I see.
And when the cabbie was lying there dying, like the first thing he says is, was I right or was I wrong? And he's gesturing with the pill, and then he angrily throws it in the dude's face too. Like it's so like he is never going to know if he was right or wrong, and that angered him more than anything has angered him in this entire show so far.
Which it's like,
you know?
Can just test the pill bottles and see which one's poison, my guy. You could just be doing that. Yeah, that's probably a correct read on this. But maybe the cabbie just misinterprets. Like, I think in losing the cabbie identifying Sherlock's drug problem from the original pilot, I think this is just like, I think this is literally just the script got chopped and changed and they forgot to adjust what was being said. Because in the original, the reason he says that is the thrill seeking is about the drugs, where like Sherlock needs to be switched off at some point because he needs to be constantly switched on and engaged, and the drugs are a way for him to like turn all of that noise off. And that's, I think, where that line comes from. So it could just be a case of the rewrites not fully collecting everything it needed to. Would be one possibility.
Kind of another interesting point here is that something that they made a great effort to focus on was that John is the only person that we see in this entire first episode who is appreciative of Sherlock. And they even have a line in there where Sherlock looks confused because John compliments his intellect. And he's like, people don't normally say that. Normally they tell me to piss off.
Yeah.
Right? And so the cabbie is the only other person that appreciates Sherlock. And like he outright says it, and he's like, we are two peas in a pod. We are both way above all of these other people, and I don't understand how they function. And the cabbie is actually trying to get Sherlock to empathize with him because he hates having to dumb down his thought process to normal everyday people. And it was just such a striking realization for me to realize that the villain is the only one besides Sherlock's best friend in this first episode who we see appreciate who Sherlock is.
Do you think that that's setting up his relationship with Moriarty and like the way that that is conveyed?
Whether or not it's setting it up intentionally.
Well, this is the thing. This is the thing. We can talk about Death of the Author when we get to season 2, because I think it's really important when it comes to a thing that happens at the end of season 1, and the way that the show starts to make fun of its fans in text. And we certainly will. Like, I'll bring up Bart's and I'll kind of set some foundations of like what that episode is doing. But I like the fact that it's sort of, I mean, because Lestrade like begrudgingly knows he needs Sherlock. But that's different than wanting to have Sherlock around or wanting to talk to him, like you're saying. Because like Watson and the killer want to talk to Sherlock. They want to be around him, whereas Lestrade knows he needs him. There's a difference there, I think.
Well, it's even more than that. I think Lestrade is the same, definitely with Donovan and Anderson, is that they are like low-key angry that he figures stuff out because they can't do it, and that's their job. Yeah. So it's the same thing with Lestrade, I think, but it's not the same thing for John, because he is not just saying, "Oh, you're so smart." He is like genuinely appreciating the thought process, and that's not something that I'm getting from Greg, that he is appreciating the thought process. It just feels a little bit different.
Yeah, okay, I see that. I mean, I suppose my argument would be like, as the show goes on, maybe that relationship evolves between him and Lestrade, so I could be projecting where it goes a little bit as well. I want to talk about the cabbie's plan, or like what is going on here. So the cabbie is dying, and he basically has no money left for his children. At some point, Moriarty and him get in contact, and he's given a deal where for each person he kills using this game or whatever, he'll get a huge amount of money. The sponsor, which we know is Moriarty, is doing this in order to lure in and engage Sherlock, seeming to know that Sherlock is driven by boredom and has some kind of addictive personality of some description. This is a key foundation of Sherlock in the show, like we were talking about, where I think, unlike the source material, in the source material, Sherlock's desire to solve the crimes is, yes, about the puzzles, but it's also about helping people a lot of the time. Whereas I think this Sherlock is a lot more compelled by his genius to do these things. Like, there is a compulsion to it. I kind of like that wrinkle, that he's not this like sort of, in the novels, Sherlock is this dignified wise ass who's like, you need me. But here it's more like, not an addiction for Sherlock, but he is certainly like, there's some kind of intrinsic part of him that needs to solve these problems. And like you said with the pill, that frustration that boils out at the end. But I just
harkening back to what they said at the beginning, that he doesn't get paid to do this stuff, which part of that is also confusing. Like, he needs a job. He needs to earn money. What does he do to earn money? He should be getting paid, because he proudly says, "I'm the only consulting detective in the world." Not if you're not getting paid. That's not a job.
Oh, it's so frustrating, because that's a really key plot point of Elementary, which is like, he needs that job with the police, like, because it brings him income. Like, it's a really, same with Joan. Like, it's a really key plot point, and here they're like, nah, is fine. So I just want to talk about the cabbie's plan, I guess, or what he's doing. So he realizes that Wilson stashed the phone on him when Sherlock texts the number. So he then calls the number and it rings out. He drives to Sherlock's flat, knowing the address from Moriarty or the website. Like, he knows how to get there because of some way. Then he's unaware that Sherlock has turned on the find a friend thing, happens to be there at the same time as the police, and walks in, confident that Sherlock will be compelled to leave with him and that the cops won't see him, somehow certain he won't get restrained. He then drives to a secure location and forces him to play the game, because Moriarty is certain that Sherlock isn't smart enough to defeat the puzzle, and if he is smart enough to defeat the puzzle, then it proves that Moriarty should be interested in him anyway. A lot of the decision-making here, I don't want to CinemaSins this, I want to get to the point here, which is a lot of the decision-making feels like it's been abstracted backwards from the Moriarty reveal, like, which is even more obvious when you watch the unaired pilot, where that reveal isn't in place and the plan is very different. So in the original pilot, Moriarty isn't mentioned, and Sherlock lures the cabbie with a ruse, which then gets him in trouble. I guess the challenge I have here is that in centralizing Moriarty's role in this, it shrinks the universe a little bit, where Sherlock becomes the center of everything in a certain sense. Like, everything relates back to him and his super awesome magical genius and the fact that Moriarty's interested in him. The frustration, or the thing that I find flummoxing about this, is the cabbie by himself was really compelling. And adding this Moriarty wrinkle does nothing but plant a hook for the next stuff that's going to happen. It doesn't actually, like, progressively complicate the cabbie's character. There's no friction here necessarily. It's just like, oh, we needed a reason to do it, and I guess the reason was, like, because he's being paid by this other guy who's interested in Sherlock. Like, I think it robs this last conflict of agency on the cabbie's behalf. I don't know. Yeah.
I think the bigger crime there is not focusing on Sherlock, but it robs the universe of the villain. And immediately I thought about Sidious, because the sequel trilogy in Star Wars did not know what to do for a villain, so they're like, let's just make everything be about Sidious. He was the mastermind behind all of it. You just couldn't see it because it was so subtle. Whatever. It's the same thing that they did with Moriarty. They're like, let's tie everything in with this one villain. We can't just have this Snoke guy out of nowhere. He can't be a cool villain all on his own. He's got to be controlled by the super secret mastermind. And that just... Not just that it makes everything about the one family, the Skywalkers, or the one person Sherlock, but it just diminishes the world to think that there can't be great villains besides the one mastermind.
Huh. That's a great parallel, actually. Yeah. I mean, yeah, definitely. Like, and it makes the world feel like, well, it's all about Moriarty and Sherlock and this battle of wits that they have. And yeah, it stops us from having interesting, like, other things in them. And I guess, like, this is the thing that's frustrating about picking this particular source material to adapt, is that the coolest thing about Sherlock Holmes is that you see it through Watson's eyes, and you kind of follow and admire and learn from what he's doing. Like, the more of these stories you read, the better you become at solving mysteries. Like, you get smarter by the end of it. Like, you feel like you've learned something about the way the world works. It changes your perception of reality inch by inch and kind of teaches you how to, like, actually do this detective work. How do you pay attention to the right kind of information? And I think here, there's no way for you to know it was Moriarty or that Moriarty exists until the show tells you. I think it just really folds into this larger issue that the show ends up facing, which is, how do you tell a story about this godlike character that knows everything while also pretending it's about the mysteries? You kind of have to have one or the other. It is really interesting that like, one thing that you just said, that this show actually does kind of, like, teach you this stuff. And like, when we first started watching this series, I was so into it, and I was, like, actually thinking, going about everyday life, like, can you do this in real life? And it was shocking. Like, if you pay attention, just watch, and I'm like, okay, this dude over here is, I know that he's right-handed. I know that he plays sports. I know that he's very physically capable. I know that he probably rode a bike here because of XYZ, like, whatever. Like, these things you could figure out just by looking, and unless you're actually trying to think on that level, most people just don't see this stuff. And it's really interesting that the show actually kind of points out that we could all be like Sherlock in some fashion if we just try to think, which is what the cabbie actually says. Well, and then it just gives up. It's like, oh, cool, we did it once. We did it for one episode, and then we went, we're done.
Yeah.
But
something that is really interesting that they did well, another point for them, is that they focus way too much on Moriarty, yes, but one thing they did really good is that Sherlock has no clue who Moriarty is. So it would have been so easy for them to have Sherlock react like, oh, Moriarty, he's the king of the underworld. He's killed 20,000 people. But no, he's like, John's like, so who's this Moriarty guy? And Sherlock is like, I have no idea. I've never heard the name before.
That is true. Yeah. Yeah, okay. That's interesting. When we get to the next episode, we can talk a little bit about that like, oh, I understand the lay of the land and the kind of people. Then in the next episode, there is a particular character who comes up who we never get told about, who Sherlock's like, oh, that was the killer. And you're like, how the fuck were we supposed, like, what are you talking about? And you're right, this episode does a really great job in that you don't need to have any more information than Sherlock does. to solve this stuff, nor to know more about what's going on. So I think in that sense, this episode really represents what the show could have been, and really what it, like, a version of it that could have been a lot more about the things this is framing itself as being about, which is solving these mysteries and these kind of murders and stuff.
There's some interesting stuff in the wrap up there. You want to go through those last couple scenes?
Yeah, let's go through the last few scenes, because I think there is some really interesting stuff here. So basically, Scotland Yard surrounds the building. They put Sherlock in a shock blanket since he's being treated for shock. This is very funny. Lestrade questions Sherlock about the shooter, and he starts to make some deductions and suddenly realizes that it's John, and so he stops talking. Sherlock and John go sort of separate to everybody, and John admits that he was the killer, but states the man was not a nice man, so he's not too worried about the death. And then he says, and he was also an awful cabbie, and they both start giggling. John asks Sherlock if he would have taken the pill, and Sherlock tries to deny it, but John basically knows that Sherlock gets his kicks from risking his life to prove he's clever, which just proves he's an idiot like the rest of the human race, which is not accurate and a weird thing to say, but that's fine. The tall man who kidnapped John appears, and Sherlock recognizes him. He wants Sherlock to join forces. A short squabble reveals that this is in fact Sherlock's brother, Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft insists that he is a minor British government official, but Sherlock informs John that he is no such thing. He is the British government. Sherlock and John walk away to a dim sum dinner while they talk about the new mystery man, Moriarty. Mycroft makes a note with Anthea to have Sherlock and John's surveillance status upgraded to grade 3. It's fun, but I think that there is some fun stuff in here, but I really dislike the way I think it's bad. I just think the Mycroft thing it has nothing to do with the episode. The very last line is so forced that I actually felt it this time, which is, he's like, upgrade the status, and she's like, whose status, sir? And then he's like, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And I'm like,
Yep,
shut the fuck up, Moffat.
I have a paragraph about that one line.
It's like, shut the fuck up, Stephen. It's the first time it gets said out loud in the show. Yeah, look, I think the wrap up is fine. I like Sherlock starting to deduce who the shooter was and then stopping himself. I think that's a really clever, like, just with the way it's framed, and the relationship between him, Lestrade, and Watson is really well centered in that. It triangulates it nicely. I also think tonally it is interesting that they kind of walk away giggling. I hate this less than I thought I would. Yeah, I don't know. What's your read on this?
It's also interesting that this is, I think, maybe the third time in this first episode that we see Sherlock try to protect John, because he immediately tells him, make sure to wash the powder burns off of your clothes and off of your hands.
Yeah.
So we've seen him at least twice try to emotionally protect him, and now he's trying to physically protect him. So again, not knowing if this is just like accidental writing or if we're actually seeing like or character progression for Sherlock, which is hard to say that that's progression because we didn't know what he was like before John. So really we needed to have this entire first episode with John not present for us to see what Sherlock was like without John.
Maybe. I mean, I think we get enough from the Molly stuff that you get the impression this is abnormal for him. I don't know. I kind of read it as like what you're saying, which is that this is like, whether it's character growth or not, there certainly are, the relationship they have is growing, right?
Yeah.
At the very least.
So you did mention the blanket scene, and I don't know what else to say about it aside from that. That was good writing. It was just hilarious that he doesn't understand why they keep putting it on him, and that just kind of speaks to. I could see people in shock actually saying that, but this is just his mental block of not understanding again, but it also doesn't quite make sense because this is like a medical thing, and it's not a human connection thing, and he doesn't understand the human connection thing, so he should have understood they're putting this on me because of shock.
Like, he knows what a shock blanket is. Like, it's just like, yeah. I mean, and this becomes a big meme as well. This shock blanket thing becomes a huge meme online at the time. We'll get into some of the internet history of the way this stuff is received as we start to work through this stuff and becomes more popular, but that scene of the shock blanket became a huge, like, kind of part of the cultural touchstone of this show. And that phrase, like the concept of a shock blanket becomes like a recurring theme in some of the queer coding and queer baiting, which we'll get into when we get to the scenes where that stuff starts to happen more.
So the last real note that I had was based around that ending and how off that last line of dialogues just sounded, because that was like the quintessential definition of when a line of dialogue is put in because the writer thought it sounded cool,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And one of the interesting things was the assistant, Athena or whatever she called herself, and how I had talked before about how she was always texting, and the inference was that she was texting the boss everything that John was saying. The same thing is happening in this scene. She is texting and not paying attention to what Mycroft is saying, which is why he has to repeat himself. So now we have taken her from a competent employee who was reporting to the boss. Now we're thinking, oh, was she ever texting him? Maybe she's on social media. She is not paying attention to her boss. Now she turns into an incompetent employee who the boss has to repeat himself to. So, just for the sake of having this line in here, you completely ruined her character. Granted, she's not a major character, but still, I don't get why they filmed this scene in that way. It's like the only thought that they put into her character was, oh, let's just always have her on her phone and she's never paying attention, and that was all the thought they put into it.
Yeah, I think it really, really does a lot of destructive work to how well set up she was. Because I, like you, had assumed she was texting Mycroft. If she's standing next to him, who the fuck is she texting?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's
and
really frustrating.
I mean, you could say that if he is the government and she is his right hand person, then she could be sending off emails that are, central intelligence stuff. So maybe it's a really important what she's actually doing. Maybe he's interrupting her, like, and she's sending nuclear codes. We don't know, but the show also doesn't give us that. And if it wanted to make her look hyper competent, they could have done that in a way better fashion than what they did. It's just also interesting how they frame her character, because she's such a side, such a side character, and it's like her only position there is to be attractive and confuse John. It almost seems like, because I mean, if you think about it, they could have cast anyone and they could have dressed that character in any fashion, and they made her look like a supermodel. So what are the implications of that? What are they trying to get across? It's just everything about her feels odd.
Yeah, we'll talk about it a lot as we move into the series. But Stephen Moffat he really struggles to write women, and really struggles to write compelling women that feel like characters. It is just not a strength he has. When we get to Mary, and we'll talk about that, and that he finally manages to create a really compelling female character and then immediately gets rid of them from the show. But yeah, I think it was just as simple as, wouldn't it be funny if John tried to hit on the attractive assistant who wasn't interested in him? Full stop. Like, I think you're right. I think that was the extent of their thinking here. I don't think it was... My intuition is that there wasn't a grand attention to detail when it came to her implementation.
I also think that, like, thinking back on the introduction of her character, was that he gets kidnapped, he gets into the car, and you would expect there to be guys in suits holding guns on him, but instead it's this drop-dead gorgeous woman. And
yeah,
that
which
probably
is supposed to be like a, subverts your expectation kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So that probably was the extent of what they thought about, and then they just had to kind of stick to that going forward.
Yeah, that sucks. Then now that you said that out loud, that I would have much preferred for them to get it right in the end of that sequence and have her. And it's because fucking Mark Gatiss wanted to say it. I guarantee it's because he was like, when he and fucking Steven were writing this episode, Mark was like, I want to be the one to say that last line because it'll sound fucking cool as shit. She could have said it. It would have been fine. Like Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson upgraded. It's like, it would have been fine.
Yeah, especially if she is calling, like, she calls and talks to some low-level employee that's sitting there on a computer, and they have no idea who she's talking about, so then she has to repeat the line. Like...
But this is the problem with this fucking show, Darth, is like, it just doesn't take that much, like, small tweaking in the editing bay of the script to make this stuff work. To go, well, how would we make the scene feel authentic and land? Instead, it's like, what's the coolest version of this? And by centering coolness and aesthetic and these dialogue sound bites that sound cool, it's the shock blanket thing, it's the, I'm a high-functioning sociopath, do your research. That kind of stylistic flourish becomes the longer we get into the show, the more I'm going to talk about it. It becomes a real problem where it ends up doing the exact stuff you just mentioned, which is for a character like that, even though it's a small moment, it completely strips away a lot of the work they did and makes her just a background character and takes away a lot of the consistency there in service of this stylistic flourish. Instead of trying to find a way to do both, the stylistic flourish always gets precedent over the continuous storytelling or the consistency. And we're going to start to see that more and more and more. And I want to flag that now as like the thing that is going to become, I think, and I'm speculating here. I haven't rewatched this. You know, I've done a lot of research for this, but I haven't actually got through this full rewatch yet. As we watch these week to week, I'm interested to see how much that increasingly becomes the cause of a lot of these problems, and the symptoms look different. Where an episode later on may not make a lot of sense narratively, or a character might do something fully out of character because it ends up with a cool aesthetic line or a cool stylistic choice or a cool transition to a different scene, rather than something that's consistent with character that is also stylistically appropriate. And so I wonder how much that is going to become the central problem this show ends up having, which is it wants to be cool. And it's really interested in being cool. And it's really focused on being cool. And I think it's possible that it should have had loftier ambitions. So I'm curious to see how that kind of evolves. Do you have any sort of last points that you wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
I mean, overall, we've, I think, had more negative things than positive to say about this first episode, but it was much stronger of an opening than it could have been.
Yeah.
I definitely don't want to harp on it that much because I still think it was a at least fantastic introduction for John. Although I'm not sure how much character development we get out of him. We see him get over his like PTSD, but maybe that's enough for one episode of introduction. We can infer a lot of character development for Sherlock, even though we kind of have to assume a little bit about his backstory. We get introduction to all the secondary characters in Sherlock's life. So in locations, we get we get his home, we get the front street, which a lot of stuff happens on. We get the morgue where a lot of stuff happens. So we get some popular locations introduced already. So yep. It's a pretty strong opening, opening episode that gives a backbone to the entire thing, which is, I mean, it's probably way more critical than we give it credit for. And I don't know how many times I brought up Big Bang Theory in this episode, but I keep thinking back to their pilot and some of the stuff that changed from their pilot to later on, and the stuff that they did that was good, that stuck, and the stuff that they did that wasn't good and didn't stick. Because like at the very beginning, like Sheldon is not asexual at all, and his character completely changes going forward. Mm-hmm. And there's just so much that can change from the pilot episode where they don't know what the characters are, and the writers are still figuring stuff out. And it feels like for the most part, they kind of know where they're going with these characters and with this story, and they're already dropping hints about what's going to happen, like 10 episodes ahead.
Yeah, so I wonder to what extent that is. I think that's definitely true, and I think you're right. It sets up a lot of their small play as well. One thing I'm interested in us exploring as we go forward is, and this is how writing works, right? Which is that you need to get somewhere. So what you do is you reverse engineer things from what already happened. So you go, oh, well, that thing happened in episode 1. Let's tie that into this thing that's going to happen in episode 4 kind of thing. That's just how storytelling works. One of the things this show, I'm interested to see how well it lands a lot of this stuff in this retrospective lens, is in looking back in that way and looking back and trying to construct these threads, to what extent there is a point, and I know the exact point, I'm curious to see when we get to it, where they stop trying. And they, like, the thing you're saying is, like, they absolutely do it for the first season and change. There's a point where they go, fuck, it's too hard. Like, we're just going to start making shit up. And it's really interesting to me that you're right. It does do a lot of this really well in the first kind of 3 episodes. So I'm curious to see where we might start to identify the threads of where that might start to fall apart. But yeah, to your point, like, it's a solid pilot. I enjoyed it. I said to you, I think, before we started recording, I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would coming back to it. But Well, I think we've already identified a lot of the things that are working well, and some of the things that we're going to start to pull on as consistent threads throughout that maybe will reveal some of the show's possible challenges that will grow and kind of potentially eventually subsume it, I think, by the time it does end. So it's probably a good place to wrap up. Join us next time for episode 2. We'll be covering The Blind Banker, which is probably the first real episode of the show where there's not a lot of world building. It's all just focused on the mystery at hand. And we'll kind of dive into that one next time. So be sure to either watch that in the interim or follow along. You can find all the stuff that I do at zeroindent.com. You can get my books at maynardtrigg.com and Darth is youtube.com/Darth. So go over there, check it out. Otherwise, we'll catch you guys next time for episode 2, which I'm really excited to get into. I think this is going to be a really compelling next episode, I think, before the finale of season 1, which is probably going to be a big meaty one for us to get into. So very excited for that. Otherwise, thanks for listening or watching, and we'll catch you next time.